Thank you all so much for being here. I know it's pouring rain today. There's flood warnings, tornado warnings, all sorts of things. So I do appreciate you all coming out today. My name is Rachel Shepard. I am the Executive Director of the Pittsburgh Commission on Human Relations. For anyone who might be unfamiliar, we are the civil rights agency for the city of Pittsburgh. In addition to investigating complaints of discrimination, we also, our goal is just to decrease unfair treatment as a whole and to promote understanding within the community by offering education and resources. So we're here today to discuss the impact that certain policies, or the lack thereof, have on the people of Pittsburgh. Our speakers are experts in serving populations that struggle with one of the most basic human rights, housing. I will allow Megan to speak further on the criminal history piece, and instead I'll focus on my passion for language access. It is not a novel idea that we should be accommodating newcomers to Pittsburgh with language access options. Title VI of the Civil Rights Act protects those who contribute to society by ensuring that entities receiving federal funding will not discriminate on the basis of race, color, or national origin. The programs must therefore be accessible to the people who fall under those protections. The laws are there, the policies are in place, so what is standing in the way? The fear of those who are unlike ourselves keeps us from fully engaging with others.
Thank you.
Today we will explore the changing cultural landscape of Pittsburgh and the barriers our international community faces when it comes to housing. Our hope is that this information will bring clarity necessary to see these folks as individuals, not just an extra set of checkboxes or an uncomfortable phone call. Ultimately, we all want the same thing, an equal opportunity to live and to thrive.
Sure.
The Commission on Human Relations is a fair housing assistance program and is substantially equivalent to the Department of Housing and Urban Development. We not only enforce the Fair Housing Act as an extension of HUD, but can create and enforce local protections as well. Among our local protected classes are preferred language and citizenship or immigration status. To clarify, protections are added on an as-needed basis. The goal is not to punish housing providers for wrongdoing, but to find a path forward where there can be equal housing choice for all. We are not interested in maintaining the status quo, but in creating an environment that all people are proud to call home.
Thank you.
Your being here today shows that you are also invested in this reality, and I thank you for taking this step forward with us. Thanks.
Good morning, everybody. Let me say a hearty and a heartfelt thank you to every single person here today in person. It is 100% chance of rain, and yesterday was our tornado warning. After the rain that occurred at our fall event, I've told many of you that I will start consulting the almanac before we schedule our next fair housing event. So I really appreciate everyone who's here today. To introduce myself, my name is Megan Hammond. I am the Executive Director of the Fair Housing Partnership of Greater Pittsburgh. And today we're commemorating April as both Fair Housing and Second Chance Month. Fair housing, as you all know, is not a buzzword that we toss around once a year. It's a value that we must choose to embed in our communities to provide all of us with housing choice and opportunity. So, using Pennsylvania's Uniform Crime Reporting System, or what's known as UCR, publicly available data online, in 2018, the most recent year for which the data is available, about 44% of all arrests within Allegheny County were of Black individuals, while about 13% of the county's residents are Black. Now, in Lawrence County, Pennsylvania, which is right in between Beaver and Butler counties, about 24% of all 2018 arrests were of Black individuals, while about 4.3% of Lawrence County's residents are Black. We're going to return to this data and what it means to housing and housing access throughout this morning. But first, let's look at HUD's own affirmatively furthering fair housing tool. In the city of Pittsburgh, our own low-income public housing units have about 88.09% of the households are Black households. Yet within other multifamily units, and that includes units such as Section 811, which is housing for people with disabilities, or Section 202, which is housing for senior citizens, 47.3% of those households are Black households. So why is there racial disparities or racial segregation based on the type of federal subsidy that any given federal housing provider is receiving? And let's pull out for a second and look at Allegheny County. Similarly, but looking at different types of federal programs, the Housing Choice Voucher Program, which is otherwise known as Section 8, 67.69% of all Section 8 households in Allegheny County are Black households. But then if we look at project-based Section 8, and project-based Section 8 is when the subsidy is tied to the unit and not to the individual, a different type of federal subsidy, 35.18% of those households are Black. And so in both the city of Pittsburgh and Allegheny County, there is almost more than half of a difference in the Black populations or the Black households who are using these different types of federal subsidy in the housing programs. And so the data simply shows that our federally funded housing is racially segregated based on the type of housing subsidy. And unfortunately, this disparity exists nationwide. Our housing and its racial segregation, its disability access, its language access, our housing represents our shared values. So remember what affirmatively furthering fair housing is. It's a regulation built within the 1968 Federal Fair Housing Act that says that recipients of federal funds must continuously address the existing housing discrimination within our communities. But what does that actually mean? To me, the embodiment of AFFH for Pittsburgh, Allegheny County, and Western Pennsylvania is Within Two Trains Running, a play written in 1990 by the esteemed Pittsburgh playwright, August Wilson. The play is set in Pittsburgh's Hill District in 1969. And one of the main characters is a man named Memphis. And August Wilson describes him at the very beginning of the play. He says, a self-made man whose values are hard work, diligence, persistence, and honesty have been consistently challenged by the circumstances of his life. His greatest asset is his impeccable logic. Now, in the play, August tells us a story about his life, what he's been through. And he explains that he's moved to Pittsburgh from Jackson, Mississippi. And he moved into the Hill District. He started a business. He started a restaurant. He owns property. And Memphis is telling a group of other friends in the play that his dream is one day he's going to return to Jackson, Mississippi, and he's going to get his land back. What had happened was Memphis had purchased land in Jackson and he built up a farm. However, he found water on the property that made it more valuable. And once he found the water on the property, the previous owner stepped in and said that the deed was voided if water was found on the property. Memphis goes to court. He does everything, the system, and everything we tell him to do. He goes to court and he challenges the taking back of his property by the original owner. And he tells us that he saw the judge, and the judge said the deed was null and void and he had lost the property. After the hearing, Memphis walks home, and he says when he got home, they had set fire to his crop. And in order to return home, he had to walk through the fire to get to his house. And what he says is, I wasn't ready to do that. So instead, he moves to Pittsburgh. Now what happens in the play is Memphis, he's talking to Aunt Esther in the Hill District. And Aunt Esther responds like a Pittsburgher. And what she says when Memphis tells her the story about what happened in Jackson, Mississippi, about what he's been through in his life, she says, if you drop the ball, you got to go back and pick it up. Ain't no need to keep running. If you get to the end zone, it won't be a touchdown. It ain't gonna be a touchdown. Aunt Esther is the Pittsburgher that either all of us in this room know or we are Aunt Esther ourselves, because she took a complex federal regulatory requirement and she distilled it into a football analogy. That running the ball requires holding the ball, and running into the end zone to score requires holding the ball in the first place. AFFH, at its very core of what we're discussing today, is about going back and picking up that ball, because we won't score a touchdown in Pittsburgh or Allegheny County or Western PA if we keep running forward empty-handed. Today, we begin a task that is twofold. One, our first task is to ask ourselves, why is there racial segregation within our federally subsidized housing? Our second task is to make a plan of action to address it, using as our baseline that the core of fair housing is choice. The goal of our action plan is for low-income families to have actual choice in deciding what neighborhood to live in, to pick. No one in our communities should have to walk through fire in order to get home. So let me give you an example of what being faced with walking through fire to get home looks like in the Pittsburgh region today. In 2021, at FHP, we were contacted by a man, and he, at the time, was a 61-year-old black man. He alleged that he had replied to a housing ad that was posted online, and it was for a unit in Natrona Heights. And Natrona Heights is a suburb about 30, 40 minutes to Pittsburgh's northeast. And what he alleged is that the landlord stated to him that there were no pets and no smoking allowed in the apartment, as well as that the background check required no felonies whatsoever, a blanket ban. And so our client explained to the landlord, he said, I'm in my 60s now, but I was incarcerated decades ago in my 20s for a felony. I served my time. No additional criminal history has happened. But I am telling you this because when you run my background, you will in fact see the felony in my background from 40 years ago in my 20s. The landlord looked at him and said, or the landlord was on the phone, said, I'm sorry, I can't rent to you. That's the rule. So the individual, the 61-year-old black man who has seen a lot, called FHP, and he reports the incident, and he felt that he had been voice profiled as a black man by this landlord in Natrona Heights. And he no longer wanted the unit. He didn't want to walk through this fire to get to this house. He only wanted to report what had happened in case something could be done about it. So at FHP, we did one of the things that we do best. We did a testing investigation. We had black testers and white testers respond to the rental housing advertisement. All the testers' calls went to voicemail. White testers received call responses or text message responses on the same day they left the voicemail. No black tester received a return call, return text, or return communication. And honestly, that was unexpected because we thought what we were testing was a blanket ban on not allowing anyone with a felony conviction in order to be approved as a rental applicant. So what happened was both white testers were told that there were no pets allowed and no smoking was allowed, just as had been reported to us by the original client. And additionally, both the white testers said they told the landlord that they had a previous felony conviction for shoplifting. And both white testers were told that everything about an applicant is taken into consideration, such as whether there is a pattern of criminal behavior or if the conviction was a singular incident. An individualized assessment was available from this landlord to white potential applicants, and the blanket ban on no felonies was no longer applicable. So what are we supposed to do when we do everything that is required of us and we're still denied access to housing? So what I want you to take away the most from today is that the practices that we're discussing about the use of criminal history in housing decision-making and language access within housing, they're not new policies. Our goal for 2024 is to collaborate amongst all of us here, the federally funded housing providers, the municipalities, the housing advocates, and all the stakeholders to model for the private housing market that widening our housing opportunities benefits all of us. In 2024, the onus is on us, the responsibility is on us to not be satisfied with standing still on what we accomplished in 1968, but on moving fair housing forward. So we are here today to kick off Fair Housing Month to inspire and to compel all of us to action. Changing the status quo is a Herculean task, and we cannot do it by ourselves. We need help. And so remember that on April 11th, in 1968, the Federal Fair Housing Act was signed into law after the bill had previously failed to pass repeatedly throughout the 1960s due to the complexity of discussing housing discrimination. So today, on April 3rd, 2024, the responsibility is on us to go back together and pick up the ball before we keep running down the field and maintaining the status quo of our housing market. We have the tools, but we must make the decision together and collectively to use those tools to change our community to reflect the values that we all have. Thank you. And I am extremely proud and grateful to have the support of our Pittsburgh HUD field office here today. And so we will turn it over to Michael Horvath, who is a phenomenal supporter of fair housing. I appreciate, again, every single one being here. Thank you very much.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Michael Horvath. I'm the Field Office Director for the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development Pittsburgh Field Office covering Western Pennsylvania. I want to thank Megan Hammond and Rachel Shepard, as well as the team at the Fair Housing Partnership of Greater Pittsburgh and the Pittsburgh Commission on Human Relations for coordinating this event today. This month, HUD is commemorating the 56th anniversary of the signing of the Fair Housing Act, with events that highlight the impact and significance of this landmark civil rights law. In fact, our regional Fair Housing Director is in Pittsburgh today, up in Cranberry, speaking to a group of folks representing housing authorities across Western Pennsylvania and upstate New York. The theme for HUD of Fair Housing Month is Fair Housing, the Act in Action. HUD is working to protect and expand fair housing rights to ensure that all people have the right to obtain housing of their choice, free from discrimination. HUD proudly remains committed to expanding and protecting fair housing rights for future generations. President Biden believes that every American deserves access to quality and affordable homes. His administration is pursuing an all-of-government approach to build more housing and lower-cost housing. In February, the Biden-Harris administration announced a series of new actions that will bolster federal programs with a proven track record of producing affordable housing, boost the supply of affordable housing and manufactured homes, and promote fairer, more transparent rental markets. While the Fair Housing Act is an important cornerstone of ensuring that the housing market is equal and fair, there is a continuing need to bolster existing laws and enforcement efforts and to pass new laws to address the nation's fair housing needs. Sadly, millions of renters experience discrimination in the housing market annually, and few ever report it. Discrimination in housing takes many forms, many of which can be difficult to identify. As we've heard, research finds that many markets, property managers are less likely to respond to prospective Black and Latino tenants when they inquire about open rental listings. People with disabilities face unequal treatment, access barriers, harassment, retaliation, discriminatory statements, and failure to provide reasonable accommodations for policies and allowance for reasonable modifications to unit design at disproportionate levels. Likewise, survivors of domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, and stalking are at greater risk of homelessness and housing discrimination because of the violence committed against them. Source of income discrimination is the practice of not renting to a household or withholding property services, facilities, or privileges based on the source of income of the individual, which can include a housing choice voucher and other forms of housing subsidy or non-wage income such as alimony or child support. Last month, HUD launched a website to combat the source of income discrimination for families using housing vouchers. HUD launches this resource in alignment with the principles laid out in the Biden-Harris administration's blueprint for a renter's Bill of Rights. And it's at a time where lower-income families face tremendous challenges finding safe, quality, and affordable housing. Leveraging all of its resources, HUD is dedicated to ensuring that families with housing choice vouchers have access to the housing and neighborhoods of their choice. And HUD is serious about protecting all Americans. You can ask the Grapevine Housing Authority. Last month, HUD charged the Housing Authority and its executive director with discriminating against and failure to provide reasonable accommodations for a tenant with a disability. HUD is committed to actively enforcing the Act in its efforts to eradicate housing discrimination. As HUD Acting Secretary Adrian Todman said, HUD is committed to rooting out any and all forms of discrimination in housing, not just through words, but through all resources. We appreciate our partners. It takes active partnerships, and we can all agree that HUD cannot solve discrimination matters alone. Today's convening demonstrates the power of partnerships. Thank you for your partnership and working to meet the full promise of the Fair Housing Act.
It is my greatest pleasure and appreciation to introduce the phenomenal representative of our district here in Pittsburgh. And phenomenal because, as you heard me say, that the Fair Housing Act passed in 1968 after a decade in which Congress failed to pass housing discrimination law, even while other civil rights acts were being passed. Because housing discrimination is complex, and it's hard, and it's not easy. And so the support that we have both at the Pittsburgh HUD field office and the support that we have with our federal district representative in Summer Lee is absolutely phenomenal. It is my incredible pleasure to introduce Congresswoman Summer Lee.
Good morning, everybody. Let me tell you, this is such a weird situation because the lights are coming here, so I can't even see more than like 30 feet in front of me. So if you're looking at me, I'm sorry that I cannot see you. But good morning, happy Fair Housing Month. It is such an honor to be here with each and every one of you, Megan, with all of our folks in this coalition who have, are, and continue to fight for fair housing, continue to address the cycles of poverty that we're experiencing in our community. It's an honor to be joined by Sarah Pratt, who's done critical work fighting for fair housing and recognizing that, you know, we have more to do. Housing is about more than a home. And I know that you all know that where we grow up has serious determinative effects on our lives. We've seen institutions, systems, people relegate Black and brown folks to food deserts and transit deserts, to communities that have been disproportionately affected by pollution like my own, and to neighborhoods that have faced chronic disinvestment and reinforced cycles of poverty. And when I say that out loud, I think about what compelled me to run for office in the first time, and people thought maybe it was a little too cerebral when we talked about poverty and racial inequity are cyclical. If you live in a poor community and working class community community, you were probably there because of federal policies or banking policies. Those communities also have school systems that were underfunded. These same communities have a lack of transportation and a lack of jobs, locking people into a physical cycle that they inherit and that they pass down generation after generation for far too long. We have sought to incarcerate our way out of so many of these problems. We know that problems like a lack of affordable housing and struggles with mental health and substance use disorders shouldn't be addressed through the criminalization, but we need to tackle them directly. But this isn't our lived reality. That's why in the latest federal budget, I thought to include an amendment that ensured that none of the funding included could be used to contradict the landmark Fair Housing Act of 1968. And speaking of, I'll take that. But in speaking of the Fair Housing Act of 1968, let's recall the history that Megan just went over very quickly of that groundbreaking and essential part of housing policy. April is Fair Housing Month because the Federal Fair Housing Act was signed on April 11th, 1968. We know that was 7 days after the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. The Civil Rights Act of 1964, of course, notably, did not include fair housing. And up until Dr. King's assassination, the Fair Housing Bill regularly failed to pass in Congress. So let's be real about the Fair Housing Act of 1968. While it's foundational building block of the fight for housing equity in this country, we know that we have to go further. That act was passed 55 years ago. So what does the present look like when it comes to housing discrimination? So let's recognize that we live in a country where we represent just 5% of the world's total population, but 25% of the world's incarcerated population. 1/3 of Americans have a criminal record of some sort. Black folks, of course, have been incarcerated at 3 times the rate of the rest of the population. And housing discrimination has been the single greatest inhibitor of building black wealth and generational wealth. Black citizens have just 15% of the wealth of their white counterparts. So what can HUD do to continue to address this systemic problem? The affirmatively furthering fair housing rule is one of the tools we have to fight back against cycles of poverty and racial discrimination, to recognize that we can't continue to lock people up for desperation and subsequently lock them out of opportunity. The proposed changes to the 2015 affirmatively furthering fair housing rule will allow HUD to finally ensure that the Fair Housing Act lives up to its name. It mandates that housing agencies and program participants understand that the systemic ways that Black and brown and poor communities have been locked out of housing opportunity. The changes to the rule proactively take meaningful steps to overcome patterns of segregation, to promote housing choice, to eliminate disparities and opportunities, and truly foster inclusive communities free from discrimination. We can't claim to be fighting back against address segregation while allowing systems of oppression to remain in place. So we must continue to proactively shape the communities we seek to live in, and this new rule from HUD will be a step along the way to a more just housing policy. I will continue working with HUD, our state and our local officials, and advocacy groups like the Fair Housing Partnership to promote equity in housing. I promise to continue fighting side by side with all of you to finally end this era of racial and economic segregation to build an actually better future. And for this morning, I hope that you all enjoy the keynote from Sarah Pratt, the panels and the conversations on criminal history and language access that are all going to be taking place afterwards. So with that said, may our work and the intention here today give us the confidence that we need to change, to address all of these systemic barriers that are keeping us from the prosperous future, the fair housing, the equity, and the justice that we all deserve and that you all have been fighting for. So I thank you so much. I thank you for all the work, and I hope and I wish you all a very prosperous and a very productive conference here today.
Good.
I am ecstatic at the audience that we have here today and the speakers, as we have presenters and speakers and audience members who need no introduction. So to kick us off into the actual discussion, what do we do next? What changes do we need to see in how criminal history is used in housing decision-making by the private market, by federally funded housing providers as a matter of racial equity for accessing housing? The esteemed and the wonderful who has been at every version of fair housing roles that there exist in this country. I am beyond proud to have in Pittsburgh and to introduce to lead our discussion here today, Sarah Pratt of Roman Colfax.
Hi, y'all. I'm so happy to be here, and I see now where fine Representative Summerly is saying, I cannot see any of you. I mean, do you exist? It's like a church.
We're here.
You're sitting all in the back pews. Nobody is down here in the front row. That's okay. I sing in the choir at my church, and I'll just be extra loud for you guys in the back. Who's going to put my PowerPoint? Oh, there it is. I have a PowerPoint. So I came here yesterday from Washington, D.C. I don't object to rain. I was happy not to find a tornado or a hurricane on my route. Y'all doing okay on my sound? I really feel, is that better? Okay. Okay, good. So thank you to Megan and Rachel for putting on this conference and asking me to come. The two subjects, the big subjects you're talking about today, my presentation on criminal background and with the panel later, and then the presentations this afternoon on language access, are two issues that are really close to my heart. They are issues that are not in the front lines of fair housing right now, and yet I think they're two of the most significant barriers to access to fair and equitable housing, and they're not on people's radar screens. And so you're coming together here for me, and the reason why I came is to clue you in on this from my point of view, at least on this issue this morning, and to ask you to work on this issue in your community with your friends, your allies, and your colleagues, as well as the people who need to know about it but are not necessarily your friends, allies, or colleagues, and to make change. Because I've taken the position for a while that in fair housing we work on issues, kind of as they come in the front door and smack us in the face. But I've been an advocate for taking those issues on in a more systemic way, in a more thoughtful way, an intentional way, to look at what the barriers are to full participation in housing choices and address those. It's the digging down deeper. For me, that's what Black Lives Matters was about. That's what civil rights work originally was about, the need to take the deeper dive into the harder issues and untangle them and pull them apart and create increased access and, frankly, create increased understanding for people who work in this arena. And that means nonprofit groups that work directly or indirectly with housing issues. It means housers themselves. And I mean public and assisted housing. I also mean private landlords. I mean dormitories, and the way colleges run dormitories, which happen to be housing covered by the Fair Housing Act, and how cities address housing issues. All of those issues are connected, and until we understand that and start taking apart the harder issues, the systemic issues, the institutionalized issues, we will not have done our job if we are committed to justice. That's my lecture. Okay, so think about this. A 34-year-old young man, deacon in his church, bank manager, married with a child, is looking for a nice apartment in a city not too far away, and he can't find a 2-bedroom apartment. He's looking, he can't get one. He makes the money. He cannot get one because he had a conviction for shoplifting a good suit that he needed to wear to a job interview when he was 19. Or the 60-year-old woman who's a longtime successful tenant in an apartment complex, a subsidized apartment complex, subsidized with tax credits, who needed to transfer her to a ground floor apartment because her arthritis was getting so bad. And the landlord ran a criminal background check on her because they treated her as a new applicant when she transferred and treated her as if she were applying for the first time for the apartment, although she'd been a successful tenant for 4 years at the apartment, and attempted to evict her when they found a long ago conviction for shoplifting on her criminal background. Or think about the young man who has a conviction for burglary when he was addicted to drugs. He served his 2 years. He's released from prison, and he can't find affordable, safe housing to live in, although he has now landed a good job. And he can't find that housing because he has that criminal background. Those are the people behind the presentation that I'm going to make to you today. Let's see. Where do I have to point? There?
Yes.
And there we go. That is, those people, and many others like them, are the people that we're talking about. It's why it matters to talk about the barriers of criminal records to people's access to housing. It couldn't actually be more timely when we talk about being more attentive to the institutionalized barriers in our society that have been developed over time by racism and by racialized systems. So we know that, as the representative suggested, African Americans or blacks are disproportionately impacted by the justice system from everywhere from arrests. I live in Washington, D.C. Studies there show that young black men are 10 times as likely to be arrested for traffic violations as white young men, who I can assure you drive similarly recklessly to young black men. And those are true patterns of injustices and disparities in the racial justice system, starting with arrest, going through the criminal justice system. I work with young people, many of color. In Washington, D.C., I've worked with them to try to get expunged convictions, criminal records that occurred when they were juveniles or when they were 19 or 20, as they now have gone through a life change and are now looking for jobs or apartments. I found that they often have zero understanding of what happened to them in the criminal justice system. So one young woman who has made something out of her life, has completed massage therapist training, was looking to be licensed as a massage therapist in Washington, D.C., put on her application for a license that she had been convicted of a felony. What do you think happened? They turned her down. And she comes to me saying, "Help me, Miss Sarah." And I'm like, what am I going to do about this? So I look at her criminal background. You know what? She was not convicted of a felony. She thought she was. She was charged with a felony. They plea bargained it down to a misdemeanor. And they discharged or dismissed the charges after she did community service. That's not the same thing as a conviction for a felony, right? She pled guilty to a misdemeanor. And the charges were dismissed eventually. Well, the criminal record systems don't always show the accurate reports of what has actually happened to someone, but also the people in the criminal justice system often do not understand exactly what it is that has happened to them, and often don't even report it correctly. And the reporting systems that provide the information that are relied on by landlords and others to make decisions about housing and other opportunities, including job opportunities, often are inaccurate, and people don't even understand that they have the right to get their systems updated, changed, corrected, or expunged. And so they wear this not as a badge of honor, but as a burden on their shoulders as they go through life. Always kind of afraid to look for a new place to live, even if their old place is kind of rotten and they can afford a better place, being very afraid of the housing search process, and being often homeless as a result of these discriminatory policies. So housing in particular is one of the particular barriers that previously incarcerated persons confront. 1 out of 10 people who have been incarcerated first were homeless before they were incarcerated, and similarly, 1 in 10 of them, of that group, have been reported to be homeless after they have been incarcerated. If you've talked to people on the streets at all, you know a lot of them have done jail time. I made the acquaintance at a training I did like this of a man who is now in his 60s, uses a wheelchair, had done prison time, and he came out of prison and he got shot fairly soon after he left prison, and changed his life and got disability payments, and is still having trouble finding an apartment, although he doesn't lead the life of crime at all. He was injured, he uses a wheelchair, and he still can't find housing because of that long ago criminal conviction about events that are so long ago in his memory he can barely remember what he was charged with. So access to housing is one of the most specifically and directly impacted by this, the fact that someone has had an engagement with the criminal background system. And it's widespread, and it's true. It's true in Pittsburgh. It's true in Pennsylvania generally. I have had a client who challenged an apartment complex that had a criminal background policy that had a blanket ban on felony convictions, and I did the analysis of the data for Bucks County. Okay, it's not Pittsburgh. I did the analysis. African Americans were more likely to be arrested proportionately than whites, more likely to be convicted than whites, more likely to be charged and put into jail or to end up in jail serving time than whites, and more likely to be incarcerated generally than whites who committed similar crimes in Bucks County and in the state of Pennsylvania from data a couple of years ago. So we know that this engagement is one, sometimes wrong in the first place, but even if it's not wrong, and if it's the person did their time, we know that the impact of it remains a significant barrier, and a significant barrier to those people in terms of trying to normalize their life, whether it's to stay with family while they're getting their feet in the ground, or maybe they're doing transitional housing and as they get out of prison. My brother worked in such a program in Pennsylvania down in Middletown area for years. And so looking at people who come out of prison who work in transitional housing that are working jobs and get jobs and have good incomes and yet have a problem of getting to housing that they can financially afford, but where the barrier of the criminal background still remains. The other thing I want to say about this as I go through this is this data is true for the Pittsburgh area.
So,
Black men in Pittsburgh in 2020 were arrested at 6.2 times the rate for white males. Young black men, young black people aged out 19 to 29 were arrested at 10.2 times the rate of whites. That's in Pittsburgh 2020, and I cite my authority for this so that you can go look at the report yourself. Ralph Bang's Black-White Disparities in Arrest in the City of Pittsburgh 2021. So one of the things in working on this issue in your community is to know what the resources are that show the race-based disparities in the criminal justice system in your community. And if you don't know them, people like Rachel or Megan can tell you some of the numbers and talk to you about the racial impact of engagement with the criminal justice system and the disparities based on race there. So I think the main thing I want to leave you with is that this is a national concern, it is a statewide concern, it is a local concern right here in Pittsburgh. And while you may have one angle that's working on the criminal justice system or talking to the criminal justice system, you may have another system, another process where you're dealing with HUD-funded housing and subsidized housing. You may have a group of people that are talking to private landlords, but the disparities that are true here and in the state at large are the kind of things that people should be paying attention to. There should be public conversations about it, and there should be increased awareness among housers and local officials that certain stereotypes that they may hold about the impact of what people are like when they come out of prison, or how stereotypes and assumptions about how they will be deep trouble if you ever use them as tenants, have them as tenants, or have them even in a job, are not based in fact. Now, I'm a real believer in true facts, not fake facts, and so when you're looking at this issue, we want to have statistics to back us up when we're going and arguing with someone or presenting to management a proposal to change how we apply a criminal background policy screening to applicants for our kind of housing.
Yep. Go ahead.
So most of you know that I've done fair housing work for most of my life. I started working in fair housing before most of you were born. I'm looking at you, Jay Dworen. Okay, I started in 1977. Were you born in 1977, Jay Dworen?
It was well before.
Okay, he says well before, but you can't prove it by me. I'm just saying, I started out doing fair housing at an equivalent state agency in Kentucky called the Kentucky Commission on Human Rights. And I find that the fair housing laws provide the basis for challenging criminal background policies. And HUD has agreed in policies that I worked on when I spent time at HUD, and then have worked on as a private lawyer since I left HUD. So I retired from HUD in 2015. And I am a lawyer with a Washington, D.C. based national law firm called Rowland Colfax. So the Fair Housing Act covers discrimination on the basis of race or color, national origin, disability, and other categories, sex discrimination. So people with criminal backgrounds are not specifically called out for protections under that law. So it's not directly, clearly a violation of the law to discriminate against someone because they have a criminal background. But HUD has said, and courts have said, that the effect of using a criminal background policy as a screening technique is likely to disproportionately affect blacks. In some communities, it will also disproportionately impact Latinos. And it may also have a discriminatory effect or operation with respect to people with disabilities. And we're going to talk about all of those this morning. Okay, so what transactions are we talking about? Almost anything relating to housing. So the rental application screening, landlords today use black box screening systems. They put in somebody's name and maybe their social security number, and they spit out a report. Those systems are often reporting outdated or incorrect information, or they pick up information that show someone has had an identity stolen, and so it shows the results of someone is incorrect. So those issues are barriers, but the system is better than it ever used to be to find out about the histories. And so with the changes in the technology, landlords have seized upon that as using it as a screening technique. But it also comes up when you're trying to add a person to a lease, right? So you've got a tenant and somebody comes out of prison or comes to live with them because they can't find housing somewhere else, and they're their son or their grandson or their daughter or granddaughter or great-granddaughter, right? And that's where the housing is. And so adding a person to the lease can be can trigger the engagement of a Fair Housing Act application situation. Screening at rental transfers, the woman I mentioned to you at the beginning of my presentation, that's a real example. An older woman lived in rental housing with a successful tenant, needed a transfer to a ground floor unit because she couldn't manage the steps with her arthritis. And they re-screened her and discovered a long ago shoplifting conviction and wanted to evict the woman. And I'm like, if that's not a case for silliness, as a landlord, you evict a tenant who has a good tenant and otherwise unblemished rental history because she was convicted of shoplifting years ago. What's the justification for that? And the absence of a legitimate justification for these very broad screening policies is fundamentally at issue when you start raising a Fair Housing Act case. We also seen criminal backgrounds come into play in mortgage lending, and in particular in small business loans. The Small Business Administration itself had a very restrictive criminal background policy for years for people for people who were applying for SBA small business loans. And people of color had a hard time getting those loans and didn't really know why. Recent investigations by the National Community Reinvestment Coalition and others, including fair housing groups, have identified the fact that although SBA has somewhat reduced their policies on this, that many lenders are still using these very broad exclusionary practice policies that the SBA had in place for many years. And so that minority businesses, whether they're Black or Latino or from another country, often have more difficulty qualifying because of some prior engagement with the criminal justice system, And finally, you see criminal background rules coming into play even by HOAs, housing associations that often run condos and co-ops, and even in co-op rules. So it crosses the span of housing opportunities. I expect to see one coming up any day now involved with the application by a nursing home or a continuing care community. All right, there are a couple of connections and specific exclusions in the Fair Housing Act I do want to talk about so that you know this. And the biggest one is people with disabilities whose tenancy would constitute a direct threat to the health or safety of others or to the property of others may be excluded. And so this is a provision in the Fair Housing Act that basically addresses the risk issue. And we'd be crazy if we didn't say, oh my gosh, there may be some risk to someone who's had some prior engagement with the criminal justice system. Yes, there may be some risk. But the question is, what is the risk? And how much of a risk is it, given the passage of time, given what the crime was, given what the current circumstances are of the current individual? So these provisions are there. They don't mean that a landlord cannot rent to someone. Of course, the landlord can rent to someone, even if they've had a recent history of making little fires in their apartments. The landlord can accept them if they decide to under particular circumstances that they choose. But on the other hand, if that's their recent history, that the idea that someone is building fires in their apartment does potentially present a direct threat to the property of others, at least. Notice that that's not involving a person who has a direct threat of an injury to themselves. It's the other people or the property of other people. So sometimes landlords, in a misguided effort to protect the person themselves, say, I can't rent to you because it's better for you. It is never better for that person not to be rented to. I'm just going to tell you that. I mean, assuming they financially qualify and they're eligible for the housing otherwise, then turning one down for their own protection is something the Fair Housing Act often is used to challenge. The conviction for manufacturing or distributing illegal drugs, that person is, again, not protected by the Fair Housing Act, regardless of when the conviction was, but it's a very narrow conviction, and I mean a very, very narrow standard for a conviction, and a landlord can still rent to the person who has this history. The law doesn't say you cannot rent to them. It just says that those persons cannot claim protection under the Fair Housing Act. So a housing provider can always agree to a policy that would not discriminate against the people with these types of convictions, but they can also lawfully exclude them if they have engaged in that conduct that presents a direct threat to the health or safety of others or the property of others. So, Fair Housing Act also allows complaints and administrative complaints or court cases brought on behalf of victims of discrimination. And I just want to say about this that those complaints are not always brought by the particular individuals who have encountered discrimination. Cases can also be brought by organizations who support or work with people who have prior engagement with the criminal justice system, who have convictions or who are just out of prison and are looking for housing. Why? Because that agency is helping the people, and those people are looking for housing. That agency's work is impacted if landlords keep discriminating against those folks who are trying to find housing. So that individual can file a complaint if they've been injured by a landlord's practice, but so also can the organization that is assisting them. There's a nationally recognized organization called the Fortune Society in New York City that helps ex-offenders find, and I hate that term, sorry I used it, people who have recently released from incarceration find housing and jobs and resettlements within the community, and they themselves as an organization have filed major lawsuits, and my law firm has represented them against large landlords in the New York area. And when those lawsuits get filed, they are challenging both the discriminatory practices, they're looking for a change in policies, a much narrower and supportive policy towards people who have been released from incarceration, less discrimination in the application and selection process, and large amounts of damages. I just want to say that that's available under the Fair Housing Act. And again, Rachel's office here in Pittsburgh, the Human Relations Commission, enforces those laws, and Megan's advocacy organization, the Fair Housing Partnership of Greater Pittsburgh, also works with people who have been victimized by this kind of discrimination. They can bring cases. Organizations can bring cases to them. Organizations and people can bring tips to them about a landlord that's discriminating, and they can investigate those. Specifically, Megan can, as she described earlier. And so if you know about landlords who are engaging in this practice and somebody doesn't want to challenge it directly, they can still report it and action can still be taken. And so cities, increasingly, by the way, are recognizing that these kinds of very restrictive housing policies, criminal background housing policies, create consequences. And one of the consequences can be increased homelessness, more people on the streets because they cannot find housing. And they can't find housing that are affordable that will also not block them because they have that prior engagement with the criminal justice system. So what about risk? What about the question of aren't these people posing huge risks to tenants and to other people and all of that? So the study that's best known for actually looking at real life experiences is a research study in Minnesota that were commissioned by nonprofit landlords who are actually renting to people with criminal histories. And the research, and they looked at their patterns over years, and it looked at their relationship between people who had prior engagement with the criminal justice system and their ability to be successful tenants. Here's a shocker. For the most part, a history of engagement with the criminal justice system had little effect on housing success. In other words, renting to people with this prior history did not create serious issues for the property. And this analysis, there's a deeper study which is available and which you can look at, but look at the criminal categories on the left-hand side of the screen that say no significant effect on housing outcomes. Marijuana possession. And I will give you that our attitudes about marijuana use and possession have changed over time dramatically. But there are a lot of people who are in jail for possession of tiny amounts of marijuana, still in jail for that. And so, the fact that prior conviction for marijuana possession has little or no impact on that person's ability to be a good tenant today is important knowledge. Alcohol offenses and serious traffic offenses other than DUI, prostitution, disorderly conduct, even domestic violence. So not to say that we approve of any of that, but to say that the study shows you can have a conviction for domestic violence, you can have a commission for minor drug-related offenses, and it doesn't make a difference in how you perform as a tenant later on. 4 categories may have a statistically significant effect, and they didn't have a huge number of people to look at, so the numbers were small. But each one of these makes sense. Fraud. Okay, well, if you've been out defrauding, grandmas out of their Social Security check, I would say financially there might be a risk about whether this is the kind of person who might still have some propensity towards fraud on credit cards or inability to pay rent. Assault figures, right? Assault is hitting someone or attacking someone with your hands, with a weapon, with a vehicle. Property offenses, that makes a certain amount of sense, and major drug-related offenses, where someone has made it way up the scale on drug offenses. So these offenses, even if bad, only increase the risk of negative housing outcomes by a small percentage. So the point there, if you turn the numbers around, 90% of the people, even with convictions of fraud or assault or whatever, are still successful tenants. But a small percentage of them are not. Here's the other important information, because criminal background policies often say, well, I've seen them written, to the end of time, 99 years. If you've had a conviction within 99 years of your date of application, you cannot be considered. Well, how helpful is that? 99 years, somebody looks at that and just throws up their hands. How can I ever outlast that policy? But in fact, Wilder's research shows that the effect of a prior criminal offense declines over time. And look at this, the effect of a misdemeanor conviction declines after just 2 years. 2 years. And the effect of a felony conviction declines after 5 years. And I think that's because a small percentage of offenders recidivate. They engage in prior activities later on. Sometimes I'm afraid to say that they might be engaging in that behavior as a result of not having a stable housing environment, but setting that aside, there's a percentage of people who come out of prison or jail or have been convicted of a crime, and they commit the crime again. But then the 2 years and the 5-year time shows that if you've been able to make it for a period of time without another crime under your belt, that you are more likely to be a successful tenant. And look at this, criminal offenses that occurred more than 5 years prior to move-in have no significant effect on housing outcomes. So don't be telling me about a 20-year ban or 99-year ban or an absolute blanket ban. So HUD has given us some context to look at the arrests on, and this is the most definitive statement I have ever seen HUD make. I mean, I'm telling you, I worked for HUD twice for a lot of years, and HUD never says, you cannot do this or don't do this. They say, well, it depends. You know what I'm saying? I love HUD. Well, that might be a slight overstatement. I love the people who work for HUD mostly, and I love what HUD's trying to do. How about that? But my point being that HUD has actually said a landlord cannot rely only on the fact of an arrest to refuse an applicant or evict a tenant. So you can't just get a piece of paper that says, we're a police report, on a report from some other tenant that so-and-so has been arrested, and take that, or even a confirmation by the police, yeah, they've been arrested, and take action against them. You cannot. And there's specific guidance for public housing and assisted housing from HUD on this point. Long thing, lots of questions and answers, but it boils down to you cannot take action merely on the fact of an arrest. So if you get a criminal background screening report that said they were arrested for public intoxication and they had arrested for this and arrested for that, you may not take adverse action against them. Because, I don't know, we live in America. Innocent until proven guilty. I see that all over the place these days. Candidates for president are talking about it. Innocent until proven guilty. Innocent, innocent, innocent. But that is a fundamental constitutional right. Okay? And so HUD says an arrest is not enough. Now, on the other hand, if you personally saw the applicant pull a knife on someone in the elevator 2 weeks ago, and they got arrested, all right, you can take adverse action based on the conduct, but not on the arrest. Does that make sense? So you have to investigate. If someone's has a 10-year-old arrest for public intoxication or assault or battery or murder even, you can't take action just on the fact that you know they've had the arrest for it. What happened? What was the conduct? Is it likely to be repeated? How long ago was it? And so again, it's the conduct. And I think this goes back to the provision in the Fair Housing Act talking about conduct that has an imminent effect on the health or safety of others or on the property of others is the kind of conduct that you should worry about if you're a houser, not something that happened 20 years ago or even 10 years ago, based on the Wilder research, but that something that is the kind of conduct that is recent enough and of the type that really suggests there's a connection to this person being a good tenant. So, first of all, don't rely on an arrest, and don't rely on a third box bin report that someone even has a conviction, because that information is often incorrect. The very first fair housing case brought against a landlord under the Fair Housing Act on this kind of issue was actually a case of mistaken identity. A man of color, black man, applied for an apartment, didn't get it. He asked why. They gave him a report from a criminal background screening or told him where to get it. He got it. It was a report about somebody that was not him. And then he went back and said, that's not me. And they said, we don't care, we're not renting to you. And he brought a lawsuit against them, and he won, because they would have resolved the dispute in a heartbeat if he'd been white, basically. So the next part about this is don't rely solely on an arrest. Next is, okay, what am I doing? Blanket bans. Blanket bans are when a landlord has a policy that says, I will never, ever, never do this. That's a blanket ban. So a blanket ban on any conviction or any misdemeanors, or a blanket ban on all felony convictions, or a blanket ban on a list of crimes always can be challenged under the Fair Housing Act for their impact, their likely impact on blacks and possibly Latinos. And that is because, and sometimes people with disabilities, but it's hard to get the data for that. That is because the part of the inequities in the criminal justice system mean that people of color are more likely to be convicted of more serious crimes for the same kind of behavior, where a white person would get skate or would get a lower it would be bargained down to a lower misdemeanor, or something less offensive. People of color tend to get the harder end of the stick in the justice system. So that a blanket ban on all convictions or all felonies or all misdemeanors or even a list of those, HUD has said in written guidance for now since 2016 that you cannot rely on someone, and you cannot have a policy that addresses this and creates this blanket ban situation. HUD also says that you cannot use long look-back periods for past criminal activities. That is to say, even if there is a prior engagement with the criminal justice system, that you cannot ban someone forever based on some old history, because the relevance of it to your current performance of a tenant is reduced the longer ago that it was. And this is consistent with what Wilder says. I mean, Wilder says 5 years for a felony, 2 years for a misdemeanor. That's when the consequences of that prior behavior starts to be reduced in terms of predicting your future behavior. HUD also has to show that its policy, whatever it is justified, and that it's related to actual predicting whether or not this person will be a good tenant. So go back to that Wilder list of all those crimes and say, well, if you've been convicted of indecent exposure or leaving the scene of an accident, in Virginia that's a felony, bet you didn't know, don't do it in Virginia, right? I mean, you could have all kinds of felonies, but the question is, are those felonies actually related to your ability to be a good tenant today? And so you have to draw that connection between protecting other people and protecting the property on the one hand, and non-discrimination on the other. And so the policy actually has to be a thoughtful policy that balances those issues. And a landlord has to offer an individualized assessment opportunity for people who have this kind of criminal background, even if they think, like if their policy says they're okay, they're okay. But if they think I'm going to ban them because they have a felony conviction that was 4 years ago, they've been out of jail 2 years, I know they've got a job, but this conviction was for assault, I'm not sure. You still have to offer them an individualized assessment where they've offered the chance to come in and tell you what their circumstances are, so you can make an individualized decision on whether you're going to take them or not. And one of the most interesting experiments in the individualized assessment process has been written up by a place called the Vera Institute, which is based in New York, but is applicable to admissions to public housing in the city of New Orleans, where their individualized assessment process is conducted by former and present residents of the Public Housing Authority. And I think there's one management person to make sure that the process is reported back correctly. But the current residents are interviewing these people who have recent engagement with the criminal justice system and making recommendations back to the Housing Authority about whether this person should be admitted or not. And I've met one of the women that sits on this group. Am I good? I met one of the women that sits on these groups, and she was fabulous. And she talked about a guy she rejected because she could tell by how he responded to the questions that he was like defensive, he was combative, that he would not be a good tenant. So she recommended rejection. So fascinating, right? That they would have that process in place. All right. For those of you, anybody in here do public housing or assisted housing? Put up your hand, don't be ashamed. Not what I okay, so we're going to statutory exceptions on the books. But kind of stance, so we can't put on to negotiate this. Okay. Here they are. I'm not going to read them. Here's the regulations. Here's the requirements that only apply to subsidized housing or public housing. Current use of an illegal drug, really that's actionable. If you have evidence of it, that's probably actionable by everyone. If it in fact is an illegal drug, remembering that marijuana use and some other drugs are not necessarily, use is not always illegal in today's age. But they have lifetime bans for certain criterias. We tell private landlords not to adopt these statutory provisions. A lot of them go and say, oh, well, if HUD does it, it must be good enough for me. I've brought cases against such landlords because they try to do something that is not necessarily allowed for private landlords that might be allowed for federally subsidized landlords because Congress passed a law for them. Can somebody give me a time check? Okay, I'll go faster. But private landlords, we want to remind private landlords that they should not adopt these standards. I gotta say a word about one-strike rules. HUD approved one-strike rules years ago, and it went to the U.S. Supreme Court in a case called Rucker versus Davis. I mean, I was working at HUD at the time, I think, but the challenge to the one-strike rule was done on due process and constitutional basis if they were not challenged under civil rights analysis. And so we believe today that a PHA or other entity, but it's primarily PHAs, that maintains a one-strike policy is in serious jeopardy of being sued for civil rights violations. Just telling you. And so it's like this. I mean, the story presents itself in the most sympathetic way possible. Granny, that'd be somebody my age or older, lives in public housing, 16-2 and older housing maybe. Or it might be, designated elderly housing and PHA. And she has a 2-bedroom unit. Maybe she's got a disability. Maybe she's got a 1-bedroom unit, but she got grandson out of prison, has a conviction, maybe not, has some passage of time, really needs a place to stay. And or maybe he's just fine, he just out of a job, stays on the couch. Maybe they even know that he's there, he's on the lease. And then he gets arrested for something. And for one strike, an arrest is enough to evict me, Grandma, because my grandson is living with me and he's been arrested. I think those behaviors are absolutely challengeable in today's world, usually under civil rights analysis. And it's a very punitive approach to housing that doesn't account for the fact that someone who is even arrested may not actually have engaged in the conduct or may not be convicted, number one, and two, it blames the person who's trying to do their good deed for conduct that they didn't do and were not responsible for. I'm a big campaigner against one-strike rules. I encourage PHAs who still have them to really rethink them and to adopt more constructive and thoughtful and less limited policies and practices. So what are some of the takeaways?
Second.
Wow. Okay, this is the list. Don't rely on the fact of an arrest to make an adverse decision. Don't use a blanket ban based on any type of conviction. Don't use an unreasonably long look-back period. Okay, so far? Don't evict a successful tenant because something has happened. You've suddenly discovered that they have a criminal history. Don't forget to talk about reasonable accommodations, more about that in a second. And don't forget to offer the individualized assessment. So the individualized assessment is where you have a policy and someone has shown up in your screening system as having a prior engagement with the criminal justice system, and you would normally turn them down under their policy. HUD says you're supposed to offer them an individualized assessment. That assessment can be by staff or by, as I mentioned, the group in New Orleans, the Housing Authority, has tenants actually participating in the group with appropriate protections for confidentiality, of course. And they do an interview. And the person can bring to the table, and HUD says there's a whole list of things you can bring to the table, what you're doing now, how your life has changed, what your job is, what your experiences are, how you feel about crime, how you feel about living around other people. And those, and they can also come in, some letter from the pastor, or some letter from this person or that person who can attest that they're doing well and can be successful tenants. And the individualized assessment process is really important to be effective. I tell people, landlords who talk about the individualized assessment process, to keep good notes, to justify their decision, either pro or con. Pro, just in case something happens later, you know what your thinking was. And con, just in case that person files a complaint against you, you will know why it is that you made the decision. You will have justifications to back it up. The main thing is try to have substantial justifications based on conduct, based on history, based on information that counter their please help me, I need help. That are tied to their person's ability to be an effective and a good tenant today. Right, more takeaways. Apparently I'm not pointing at exactly the right thing. Okay, so do have a clear policy, apply it as consistently as you can, but change your policy to be less restrictive. Do distinguish between different types of convictions and different kinds of conduct so that you are focusing on the ones that are most likely to involve conduct that would threaten other people or other people's property. I tell landlords all the time, do train staff on how to apply your policy. You know why? Because this is how it presents. It was Megan's story. I was listening to it this morning. It's Megan's story all over again. So here's the story. I come in, and I'm looking for an apartment. I'm a white woman, probably noticed that. And and I apply, and I say in the course of I've got a job, and I can afford this apartment. I look, I really like it, so I say, I'd like to apply, but I want you to know that I have a felony conviction for trespass because I was arrested at the South African Embassy for trespass, and I took the conviction and spoke about it for years, and whatever. And they look at me and they say, oh, honey, that's fine. I'm sure that'll be fine. And then a person of color comes in, maybe it's a tester from the Fair Housing Group, or maybe it's someone else, and they come in and they say, hi, I'm black, I can afford the job, I really like this apartment, I want to apply, but before I apply, I just want to say, I have this long ago conviction, it's for leaving the scene of the accident, but blah, 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 and they look at me and say, oh, we have a policy against that. Don't bother applying, you just waste your money. That kind of unequal treatment at the front door between whites and blacks was a critical element in the two large studies based on testing evidence of how applicants were treated who had posed as people having criminal backgrounds. That white people got a better shake at the front door before the policy was even applied, and blacks were discouraged. 50%, almost 50% of the test showed that kind of difference.
for those of you who are thinking about training, thinking about this policy, or talking to someone who's thinking about changing their policy, understand that staff have to be trained about how the policy is in fact applied. And make sure that they understand that the policy, once you have a narrower and more fair housing appropriate policy, that we're going to apply that process to everyone in the same way. And that they should not be encouraging or discouraging people from applying based on a representation about a background. Because it could all come up and the person could still be eligible. All right, two more things, and I'll wrap up this part of the presentation. Is that okay? Okay, so one, I want to tell you about Sterling Glen Apartments. I was the lawyer who filed a lawsuit against Sterling Glen Apartments in Virginia. Had 300 units. It had a criminal background policy that prohibited, I love the list, any felony conviction, any terrorist-related conviction. In Chesterfield, Virginia, really? I ask you. Any illegal drug-related conviction, any prostitution-related, any sex-related conviction. What is a sex-related conviction? Just think about it. I mean, you know, is it the boyfriend that was charged by the irate father because he had sex with his 16-year-old girlfriend? Is that going to disqualify someone? So the list is kind of vague, and they include cruelty to animals, which I thought, well, I can kind of understand the cruelty to animals part, but really, these other things I had more trouble with. Okay. And also, any of these situations where adjudication was withheld or deferred adjudication, why on earth? Deferred adjudication basically means they don't have the evidence to prove there was a violation. Okay. Or if someone's had active status on probation or parole, and so many people would be disqualified for that. I have a sister-in-law who worked for probation and parole at Dauphin County for years. And she'd come home and talk about how hard it was for some of the people on probation and parole to find housing once they got out of transition housing. So we negotiated a settlement in that case, and basically the way the process works, and I'll just say this quickly, is that applicants would apply and they'd be screened based on the normal standards of income, job, credit score, if they use credit score. And if they passed those things, they would be approved contingent on an evaluation of the criminal background history. And so assume, in this case, people were qualifying based on their income or their credit and their other qualifications. On the other hand, if somebody's not going to qualify because they don't make enough money for the apartment, you don't have to run the criminal background check because they're not qualified anyway, right? So the landlord agreed to do this, and then to say, if there was a background, they agreed to say, we're going to make a decision on the criminal background alone, and then they would make the decision, but they would write in writing, notify the person that they could have an individualized assessment before they made the decision. Now they would say, we intend to reject you because of your criminal background, but we are available, so-and-so is available to meet with you to discuss it. And so they agreed to do the individualized assessment process. And we also adopted a policy that reduced the number of crimes to federal criminal convictions in the last 5 years, with specific criteria that will look a lot what we saw in the Wilder conviction. And we excluded a lot of conduct like arrest charges, expunged convictions, convictions that were reversed on appeal, and other items. That's the basis for the policy. And I think Megan may be talking about that policy later, but I will say that the Attorney General of the state of Virginia took that policy and announced to the entire state that a landlord who adopted that policy would have a safe harbor for prosecution in a criminal conviction case. And so that was a good step forward by that Attorney General, but it was also like a signal to landlords, here's the policy, just take it and adopt it, because we think it withstands the kind of scrutiny that we're going to think about here. All right, one more little example. I'm going to scoot forward. Here's a whole list of evidence that people can bring for criminal background stuff. Okay, Virginia. I just want to tell you this story because it has a happy ending. and I really like happy endings. So this is a case in Virginia, another case in Virginia in federal court, where a woman lived in an apartment complex, had been there for some time. She had a son who had a serious mental disability, and she wanted her son had been under treatment, and he needed a stable place to live. He wanted to come and live with her, and she wanted to add him to the lease. And he had a misdemeanor conviction for indecent exposure because in the throes of his mental illness and probably without medication, he had thrown himself, taken all of his clothes off and thrown himself at a fountain in a nearby town. Okay, he got convicted, and he could not contest it, it did happen, but he was under the constraints of a disability at that time. So he received medication, received counseling. There was no repetition of the event, and Mom wanted to put him on the lease, and the landlord said no, and the lawsuit ensued, and the landlord lost. Because the judge said, with these factors that we have, the evidence that would typically come up in an individualized assessment, the landlord could have known that there had been no repetition. They could have known that this was a disability-related offense. They could have known that that there's been no repetition. They could have known that the person was under treatment and no repetition had occurred, and that this person, the judge concluded, was not a risk to anyone for that particular kind of conviction. So one part of the law, the reasonable accommodation provisions, were at issue there. It was not a race or national origin discrimination case, but it was still an important threshold case about how people with disabilities sometimes get discriminated against because they've had prior engagement with the justice system because of their disabilities, which also can include drug addiction or alcohol addiction, as well as mental illness and emotional disabilities and others. So thinking about this, I would say if you know people who would like to address changing their policies, that is a subject for discussion with people who are right here in this room. Secondly, if you know people who have been discriminated against, that is a subject for discussion with people right here in this room. And also, if you're interested in increasing public awareness about this issue, that is also a subject for people here in this room and people beyond this room to help people identify issues of concern and to take action to correct them, whether it's by advice or counseling or enforcement. Thank you. I think I'm supposed to sit down and stop talking.
I am so thankful for Sarah's presence, for Summer's presence, and then on the discussion that we'll have. So let me call out Jade Warren and Luana to come up on stage to have a Q&A. And then before we get started, I'm going to go through a couple additional examples of what criminal history has looked like here in Pittsburgh and Western Pennsylvania. And additionally, it is famously a Pittsburgh day in the sense that it is pouring rain with the flash flood warning and all the fun that comes with that. And so I'm going to pivot the question and answer a bit to allow audience questions at the beginning, so that way we can let Sarah go a few minutes early in order to get to the airport, because the highway may or may not be flooding, but don't tell her that. And so if you have a question from the audience, there's a microphone set up on this side of the stage over here, and please feel free to go and line up if you have any questions that you would like to ask before we have to release her to get to the airport. But a couple more examples is I want to showcase, the PowerPoint can come up, is just to explain the context just a little bit further about what we've seen here in the region. And so, for the second president, so you've already heard me talk about the case that happened regarding Natrona Heights. And in that incident, it was a privately funded, there's no federal subsidy, where we're seeing that disparate treatment, that direct intentionality in which the criminal history is allegedly a proxy for allowing race discrimination to occur. But even when it's not intentional, when it's a concept of the rule is the rule, what you've heard from Sarah this morning has been the understanding of moving fair housing forward by making sure that we're embedding the equity concepts inside of both tenant screening and how criminal history decisions are used during tenancy when a tenant is perhaps arrested during that tenancy. And so put up the second PowerPoint, please. So one of the examples that I want to point out today is about 10 years ago, following the changeover from the public housing authorities to removing the one-strike policy. There was litigation in the courts with the housing authority of the city of Pittsburgh at that time regarding a tenant who had been convicted of a drug-related charge. And that conviction happened in 2012. Now, that conviction wasn't discovered until the tenant submitted an application 2 years later to the Housing Choice Voucher Program, otherwise known as Section 8. And what happened was, in April of 2014, when that conviction was identified, then, when the conviction was identified, what happened was, not only was the Housing Choice Voucher application denied, but their current tenancy in Arlington Heights was also stopped. Eviction proceedings were filed against them. And what happened in the court process, what happened in the depositions and the discussion on the facts, is that during those 2 years after the conviction, the tenant had successfully completed 18 months of probation and had also completed 2 internships and was undergoing current job training at the job that they were currently at. And so as it got to court, the judge looked at it and the court looked at it and said it would be a miscarriage of justice to continue to use that conviction as someone who has shown that that criminal activity is no longer ongoing. They've been a successful and a good tenant, and there was no need to disrupt that. Additionally, and so we discussed the Natrona Heights case, and then also what I want to share with you is just this past year. And so just this past year, remember that data we talked about early this morning. All this data keeps coming back. It's just data, it's facts. And so what happened in Lawrence County, Pennsylvania, right in between the Beaver and Butler counties, is that there was another application for the Section 8 program at that housing authority. And what had happened is that this applicant had been convicted of what's called welfare fraud and owed about $7,000 in restitution. And she was paying it. She entered into the required process, and all she could afford to pay was $30 a month. Her Section 8 application tenancy was denied, and she was told that the only way her Section 8 application would be approved is after she had paid her restitution in full. And at $30 a month, it would be decades. And there was no evidence, no facts, that the conviction and then her compliance with the conviction, with addressing the restitution, with doing what she was supposed to do, would mean that she would be a bad tenant. And the court said that it was an improper use of the discretion that HUD allows by denying her application. And today, that decision was made in 2023 last year, and today she has a housing choice voucher in Lawrence County. And so that is what we are here to do across Pittsburgh and Western Pennsylvania, is to make sure that we are coming together to address these policies to get housing choice and housing opportunities to all of us. So let me turn it over, and we have a couple audience questions, and please step up, say your name and where you're from, and feel free to address the panel.
Hello, my name is Carla Payne Harrison. I'm the Community Housing Coordinator for Highmark Home Care. And I know that's probably weird to hear from some people that an insurance company has a housing coordinator. I am the housing coordinator for Southwestern Pennsylvania, one housing coordinator for Southwestern Pennsylvania from Adams to Greene County. And it's a lot. So my first question is, as I go through kind of the highways and byways, I've been with Highmark for 5 years, but I've been in the housing arena for 25 years, Urban League, just a whole gambit of places I've worked for in the housing arena. One of the things across the board that I've noticed, and I'm in rooms sometimes with big wigs and HUD and Housing Authority. One thing I never hear about is the conversations that these places have with people in the community. Are we talking to the people in the community? Are we asking them what they need? Across the board, I've learned, I've seen people, and I've gone to houses, I do home visits, and things that are happening in those places are people unable to keep good, stewardship of their units. People not really good with budgeting, things like that. So sometimes evictions happen bigger than just, they did something in the community. It's evictions because they didn't pay the rent on time, and sometimes it's budgeting, sometimes it's housekeeping. Are we speaking to people in the community, or are we just waiting for them to come to our door? Because fear of retaliation is a real thing in housing. Fear of retaliation is a real thing. I'm in a lot of communities where they'll say, Miss Carla, I really want, to find out why my heat is not working, but I'm scared to go over to the rent office. If I go to the rent office, they're going to probably evict me for one reason or another, and then I try to be that advocate in the middle, there. But I want to know: are we speaking to the people? Do we know what they want? Do we know what their barriers are, or are we waiting for them to come to us? Are we waiting for them to say to us, "Hey, somebody might come to you and they say, I feel like I'm being discriminated against." That's only the 1%. That is probably 1% of the people that are brave enough to come to you, but there is a gambit of people who are dealing with that because they probably have somebody in their house that's just not supposed to be there. They're afraid that they have, in the time that they've lived in low-income housing, committed a crime or been convicted of a crime. And the very thing that you guys are talking about, there's plenty of people dealing with that. They have something has happened. They had their boyfriend living in the house. Drug raid happened. Now they're not going to say anything because they do not want to be on the radar because now they've got 4 or 5 kids living in there. The worst thing in the world that they could do is raise a fuss that their rent is, their utilities are messed up, that their windows are broken, the refrigerator isn't working. They're going to allow that stuff to keep happening because they're afraid of retaliation with saying something about that. Now that's one thing. Hold on. And I'm going to say just one more thing too. Also, I've talked to a lot of people about life skills. While we're giving people units, even when they're coming from homelessness to housing, young mothers, young families in housing with no life skills. We'll give them a unit and we'll say, take care of it. We don't care if they know how to take care of it. I would love to see or have a conversation about life skills and budgeting, how we take a person with a very limited income, who now has to pay rent, utilities, all the things, and the things that go along with living, right? How we teach those people to do those things, right, effectively in the community with limited income, TANF, SSI, SSD, that sort of thing. So those are my 2 things. Thank you.
So if I can, thanks for your question. My name is Jade Warren. I worked at the Fair Housing Partnership as the executive director for 20 years. I've worked with HUD, and I now work at a place called Cloudburst Group, which is a technical assistance provider for HUD. And everything I've done, I will still compliment Sarah in that she is a mentor for all of us, myself included, even though I was born before 1977 at least. To your question about are we in the community, and the reason I gave that background is because I've been with FHP for so long. That's where we start. Like, we recognize, and I say we as kind of the fair housing community, that we have to be in the community because we're part of the community. What you'll find in the world of fair housing and fair housing advocates is we're not people who exist in some other world. We're not, it's not the upper echelons. We are people who have been on the ground from the beginning. right? Whether in the very beginning of the fair housing movement, that we have always wanted to be. So Fair Housing Partnership, I know, has an education outreach person who puts on events in the community. You know, we are regularly there trying to hear what's going on, because what we do is actually help folks who are in those positions, not just in simply the, hey, file a complaint, because oftentimes, to your earlier point, they're unable to file a complaint. There are risks that are associated. Of course, the Fair Housing Act has retaliation covered. You don't have the right to retaliate. But that really doesn't help somebody in the moment of worrying about what action they can take or not. And so you heard Megan talk about the Fair Housing Partnership having the capacity to do testing, right, to go out into neighborhoods to see what the treatment looks like, that they can file organizational complaints, that the city commission can file city-initiated complaints, where they can take the complaint rather than have the individual take the risk. So we understand what you're saying in terms of the risk and the reality of being in the community, but I would also point out the other thing you said was correct. You know, fair housing violations are one of the least reported forms of civil rights violations that there is, and it's because of that risk of housing. To that point, individuals like you who are having those conversations, we do rely on you. We rely on you to have those conversations, reach out to us, let us know, so that we can then take the actions. But we absolutely are in the community and think it's a crucial part of the fair housing movement.
Quickly, I'll say that for housing, I do know that the Jefferson Foundation in Mon Valley did do a community voice fund for local nonprofits to have town hall meetings, that we could hear the voice of the needs of the community. So we did do that, but also that there should be more town hall meetings. I don't think there's enough of communication to find out what the community needs, and there needs to be some more communication with those residents to find out what their needs are, what their challenges are, and what their barriers are as well. As I can say that for Foundation of Hope, I'm the executive director of Foundation of Hope. I've been there for a year, but we do provide life skills and budgeting classes to those who are transitioning into re-entry into their communities. So send them to us. We will definitely provide them the life skills and the budgeting classes that they need.
I'll just add one other thing. Fair housing often sees the tip of the iceberg, and the iceberg underneath is deeply entrenched institutional problems that have to do with, do people have the skills, do people have the knowledge, do people have the money, do they have the access? I'm currently what do they call me? Consulting expert for a group that's called Millennia Resistance. Millennia is the owner and operator of many HUD-subsidized properties across the country that unfortunately the tenants in Millennia have been experiencing terrible conditions all over the country, from places as diverse as St. Louis, Atlanta, Florida, Texas. I started becoming involved with this with tenants, interviewing tenants at Sandpiper Cove in Galveston, Texas, about their experiences with Millennia. We have challenged Millennia initially because it is a housing provider that provides housing primarily to blacks in black neighborhoods, and the conditions are so dreadful that there have been reported deaths and injuries to people who live there because of their negligence. I will say that the tenants are actively involved in Millennia Resistance. We have a website. We have training meetings. The first one was last night. I unfortunately was not able to attend because I was here. We're doing virtual training of tenants about self-advocacy. And as of 2 weeks ago, HUD debarred Millennia from any new contracts. And Millennia has put on the block, or selling many of their properties to other people. And we consider this to be a significant step forward because Millennia simply was unable to manage the properties in a way that were decent conditions for the people of color who were living there. This kind of local organizing work for tenants helps because you're a unified front, and people report their stories to others, and others take the information and raise it up including to letters directly to HUD to ask for help. And so I will say unification of people in local communities is important around particular issues, and especially with the Fair Housing Partnership, their staff, and with your organization as well, there are opportunities for people to come together and address common issues. And I think post-COVID world, we should be doing more of that.
Absolutely. Thank you, everybody. The next question.
Hi, I'm Brenda Green. I'm the program manager at JFCS Refugee and Immigrant Services. And thank you so much for the presentation. It was really informative. But my question, or rather my need for clarification, is sort of the flip side with victims of crime. I've worked with several women who are victims of domestic violence and have a PFA, and a landlord refuses to even give them an application because they're afraid an ex-boyfriend or an ex-husband's going to show up and destroy the property. Or even I had a landlord one time say, I can't have the police coming here. What will the neighbors say? And so they're like, one client, in her rental application put down that, because he was concerned about the gap of the dates in her rental history, and she said, well, I was recently at a domestic violence shelter. I was living there for 4 months. And then he said, well, you're not eligible for this apartment.
Those women were victims of unlawful discrimination because of their gender, and they can file complaints or be assisted by Megan's group. I am proud to say that I wrote a memo about the application of the Fair Housing Act to victims of domestic violence in 2011. It exists, it's findable online, that says victims of domestic violence are disproportionately women. High percentage of women, and that's true at the local level as well as the national level. And they're also disproportionately women of color. And landlords may not discriminate against people who have been victims of domestic violence because of circumstances arising out of their experience with violence. And now, HUD has recently started enforcing the Violence Against Women Act, and will also accept complaints through Megan's group for landlords who do not take appropriate action with respect to victims of domestic violence. I personally have represented women who they attempted to evict them because there was damage to the property that occurred during domestic violence, or under a zero tolerance policy, which is no violence in any apartment, but they only seem to enforce it against victims of domestic violence. Those policies are challengeable under the Fair Housing Act. I want Megan to talk about this because she's been so deeply involved in enforcing that provision in Pennsylvania.
Thank you.
So what I'll touch on is to make sure everyone knows is that at the Fair Housing Partnership and the Pittsburgh Commission on Human Relations, we are tremendous supporters of applying the Fair Housing Act to survivors of domestic violence. We partner with HUD in the enforcement of the Violence Against Women requirements of federally funded housing providers that was reauthorized in 2022. That includes tremendous opportunities. We are partnering with our municipalities in how subgrantees of CDBG and other federal funds are complying with the VAWA 2022 regarding the insurance that nuisance ordinances and other ordinances by a municipality are not being used to force a landlord to evict a survivor because they're calling EMS or police services due to abuse happening at the home. And I'll share in what we strongly believe at FHP is that there is no case too small. We are not an agency that only looks for the largest systemic cases to take. We want to assist cases in which we can win with our expertise in fair housing. And in the past 6 months, we had a case where a new federally subsidized housing property was built, a phenomenal property that is highly desirable. And a single mother with a PFA against her abuser qualified on preference under VAWA preference points for the property. But then when the property became available, she was unaware, had not been told, and was not otherwise prepared to pay the entire month's rent amount in order to secure the unit with that security deposit that was about $1,800, if I remember correctly. She also had a housing choice voucher by the Allegheny County Housing Authority, which meant that her capacity to pay her rent was not in question or a concern. The issue was the security deposit. We partnered with ACHA. We worked with the federally funded, the third-party federally funded housing provider to allow her to secure the unit in order to have a payment plan for her security deposit, because there was no fundamental alteration of service or issue in terms of the finances of the property with allowing her to pay $100 a month towards a security deposit that was going into a savings account. And so we tremendously in hand with the City Commission and the protections we have for the private housing market in Pittsburgh, that survivors can be released from their lease in order to flee abuse, and that survivors in the City of Pittsburgh in private housing can have the landlord change the lock to protect themselves from an abuser. Go to the next question.
Yes, thank you. Hi, my name is Kyle Webster. I'm a landlord. I am general counsel for Action Housing. We are a large affordable housing nonprofit here based in Pittsburgh and the surrounding area. My question for Sarah is, we in 2020 adopted a fairly progressive criminal history policy for our company. And the biggest stumbling block we faced and that we continue to face is insurance, and specifically our insurer. When I talked about criminal histories in the past, a lot of landlords would point to insurance, and I always thought it was kind of an excuse to not pursue it. But we have run into the issue where our insurance company has explicitly told us, if you adopt certain things, we will deny claims if they come to fruition. And obviously, when you're running affordable housing on a fairly shoestring budget, you can't run the risk of certain insurance claims being denied. How do you respond in that case? Because it was new for me. I think we got to a decent understanding, but it does continue to be a thing that gets reviewed annually, and I'd love to just know how you advise individuals on this and what your interactions have been like with insurers.
Oh, that's a great question. Thank you so much for asking it. I'll answer part of it, maybe others will contribute, but we have dealt with this issue before, and I tell you where we did, with people who have emotional support animals and insurance companies who would tell landlords, gee, we're not gonna insure you if you permit these animals on your property. Landlords would say that, and in fact, some liability insurance companies said that they would either not insure or they would charge more money for properties that allowed, quote-unquote, pets. And a predecessor of mine at HUD wrote a memo that to the entire country, fair housing enforcement staff, that said you can file a complaint against an insurance company that requires or encourages discriminatory policies to be adopted. And my firm has brought cases against insurers for many reasons relating to discrimination, most recently against insurers, including Lloyd's of London, that refused to insure subsidized housing. And we argued that that had a disproportionate impact based on race, and we filed the lawsuit and settled it rather rapidly thereafter. And so I think the circumstances you describe are subject to discussion with your insurer, including discussion of whether or not their insistence that you have a more expanded policy might actually discriminate based on race, and that they're requiring you to adopt that kind of policy might subject you to exposure, and therefore and their conduct in treating you that way amounts also to race discrimination. So enforcement action against the insurance company is a last resort, obviously, but if you get canceled, in fact, or you get an adverse outcome that means that you have to go find another insurance company, then I would suggest you consider discussing this with the fair housing enforcers in your community and potentially taking some action.
And I will ask Sarah one more question before we let her go to fight her way through the rain to get to the airport. And unfortunately, the parkway is much too close to the river. And so, Sarah, to ask you is for federally funded housing. Can you speak to how adopting an individualized assessment for assessing a person's criminal history and how the grievance process for a denial interact?
Well, I think I actually would not use the grievance process for that. I would use the individualized assessment first as an option because it's an admission criteria usually. And so if someone has that criminal background and you're doing an individualized assessment, I would have that screening come first. If it was a positive outcome, then I would, they would be admitted and that would be the end of it. If it was a negative outcome, I think they would take it as a grievance. They could take it further up the chain as a grievance.
Absolutely. And so we just want to underscore to everyone listening is that with your community members, as bureaucratic and frustrating as a grievance process can be, is to make sure you file the grievance in order to argue the case, argue your mitigating circumstances, your specific information, and to reach out to us if you have questions or need help or advocacy with what to include in the grievance process, because it's there specifically for federal recipients and it's meant to be used. And what our role here is to make sure it is being used and that we're ensuring that the federally funded housing providers are providing it correctly. So please give me a round of applause to appreciate Sarah Pratt coming all the way out from DC. All right, so we have a few more minutes before we'll break for lunch. And so, Luana, thank you so much for being here today. And I want to ask you, can you talk about how the Foundation of Hope serves returning citizens and the impact that you all seen on how access to housing, or what access to housing has to individuals who are being released from incarceration?
So Foundation of Hope is an organization, a nonprofit organization that works with individuals who are re-entering the communities. We actually have our own pod in the jail. So most of our participants are actually coming out of our pod and coming into our program, our aftercare program, where we provide case management services to help them find housing, employment, and supportive services if they have mental health or drug and alcohol issues. So the barriers that we find is that most landlords have gotten very creative. They now they do not look at their record, but what they do is say that you have to have 3 times the income of the rent in order to get into the facility. So of course, many of them do not have 3 times. If it's $800, they do not have $2,400 a month in income. They're just coming out of jail, they're going into McDonald's or some type of retail or something where they're not making that much money. So they get around at looking at their records by saying you have to have 3 times the rent. So if by chance they have 3 times the rent, now it's you have to have first month's security, first month's rent, and last month's rent. So now you have to have over $3,000, $4,000 just to get into the unit, which is hard because there's not a lot of housing vouchers out there. Like there's HSAO who provides housing vouchers each year, but they only have a limited funding and they only provide so many vouchers to each nonprofit organization. So then that becomes an issue because now you can't get them a voucher because all the vouchers have ran out. So, we have tried to we have funding where we do provide first month's rent and security, but we don't typically pay for first month's rent, security, and, the last months of rent. So, but our funding runs out. So we're always looking for funding to try to help with rental assistance. So those are our biggest barriers, are trying to find these housing units where they're not asking for 3 times the rent. I just had an individual who came to us who came out of jail. He was on parole. He couldn't find a job, so we gave him a job as a maintenance worker with our facility. He couldn't find housing, so he was jumping from shelter to shelter. He was going into 3-quarter houses, and he was staying in the 3-quarter house. He couldn't find a place to live. It was starting to affect his mental health. He had a drug and alcohol issue as well. So we were supporting him in every avenue that we could possibly help him to get decent housing, but he wound up getting housing in an area where it's known for drugs. He ended up passing away just a couple days ago he OD'd and died in his sleep. So these are the things that are challenging for us to make sure they don't wind up in the same areas that's going to trigger something that's going to cause more harm to them and keep them safe. So that's the biggest barriers and challenges for us.
Absolutely, and thank you for telling us. And it's, what I would say is, do you think that with what you've seen in the private market with the income requirements for 3 times the rent in income, that underscores the need for our federally funded housing providers to recognize how tenant screening using criminal history needs to incorporate what we've talked about this morning in order to get federally funded housing where it's inherently affordable to a person's income, to help those who are successfully leaving incarceration to have actual access to safe housing?
Absolutely. Because the biggest problem is, as well, is that even with the HUD housing units, some of those also are asking for income that is way above and beyond what they're actually making. So even if you try to get them in subsidized housing, it's difficult. So like the experience that you gave, so she can get in there, they have the income, but trying to get the security deposit and everything else shouldn't be an issue because they're subsidized. So, yes.
We'll continue collaborating and figuring that out.
Thank you.
Jay, thank you for being here. And so earlier, I discussed the racial segregation that exists between different types of federally funded housing, wherein, for example, households that are accessing low-income public housing units and housing choice vouchers are disproportionately Black households when you compare it to project-based Section 8 and other multifamily households. So unfortunately, as we know, that racial segregation in federally funded housing exists nationwide. So can you speak further about why that racial disparity exists between the different types of federally funded housing?
Sure, so let's talk about it. If we talk about the kind of subsidies that are available to people with lower incomes, you talk about project-based, you talk about vouchers, you talk about 811, you talk about 202, you got to start a little bit back. I always tell people, these things never happen by accident, they happen by policy. And so when you talk about the policies, you go back to the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, and you start looking at the real movement, the civil rights movement, and the idea of desegregation. Well, what happens? Those who wanted to discriminate, as we talk about the suburbs and the creation of these kind of white sections, one of the things that happened during that time was people wanted to get ahead of the curve so they could continue to discriminate. Well, how does one do that? That means in the white areas that had subsidized housing, they privatized it before they were forced to integrate it. That creates this private market. When the private market is created, it's in these all-white communities that continue things like lack of public access to transportation. So what happens then? You then end up with subsidized areas that are taking, let's say, private market, which becomes predominantly white, and then what is privately managed, and then publicly managed subsidized housing, which ends up with lower outcomes, becomes predominantly Black. It creates a division that happened by policy. The outcome of that turns into one of the things that you were speaking about. When you create spaces where you say, I have less access to resources, right? There's higher crime and higher drug use, right? Not because of the resident's color of skin, right? But because in the beginning they made the decision to create a segregated community and withdrew resources. Then you get the space that we're in now. You get a space where people of color have less access to subsidized housing in higher opportunity areas. Now, one of the things that I found most stunning about that was that when you looked at the subsidies itself, you found that Black people are paying more out-of-pocket percentage of rent in those lower income areas than white people were in the subsidies in those suburbs. It is insane to me. But this is because of policy. It is not because of chance. It is not because people are Black. It is strictly because we have instituted policies over the last 50, 60 years that we're not willing to undo. So why is it? That's reason one. Reason two, zoning. It turns out, right, I'm going to create, if I want to ensure that people can't move into my area with that subsidy, zoning that restricts density, zoning that restricts multifamily. I am going to make a conscious decision in my policies that prevent people from accessing high opportunity areas. Number 3, okay, I'm going to put something in the area. Do you know when you take and you drop a little map, and the world loves maps, right? And you do 2 things. You took race and you take different types of housing, of project-based Section 8, and you're going to drop senior housing and multifamily housing. If you put that in the overlay on race, do you think you're going to find senior housing in all the black areas and multifamily housing where young black families can have an opportunity in those high opportunity white areas? Absolutely not. So again, a policy on how we develop, a policy on how we zone, a policy on how we privatize. This is what has created the segregated public housing, subsidized housing that we have today. Nothing is by accident. So the follow-up question, of course, becomes how do you address that? The same way you created it, policies. We need people to take the steps to undo what has been done. Thank you.
To follow up on that point, to ask you, so we understand that the development of affordable housing is incredibly complex, financially complex, land acquisition complex, construction complex, especially included rising construction costs. So to those affordable housing providers who are engaging in what can we do to change the status quo, what can I do to make something a bit different with this pursuit, with this development, what would be the #1 thing you recommend for racial equity in the lease-up process as we balance the complexity of financing and development, and then making sure, or is there not enough focus on then the lease-up process and the tenant screening policies and how the demographics are determined for the initial tenants who move in, because so much time and attention is focused on the development and construction process?
So I think at the point that you have gotten through the development process, which is a win in of itself, let's be clear about that, right? What you heard from the panelists before, right, was about ensuring that you're not creating these spaces of blanket policies. I think that creates the initial barrier. One thing to understand, and I think going back to your space on kind of criminal history just generally, right, one thing to understand is that this is really about ensuring that people have opportunities. I don't love when we talk about the statistics, even though we have to talk about the statistics, because when we talk about the statistics, we're not actually saying these are people. We're saying they're numbers. So if you step back from that and you say to yourself, what I want to do is have a policy that says I'm going to look at every individual. I'm going to assess their situation, see what's going on. You and I know, because we worked together for a long time, in the space of what criminal histories look like for people, not for statistics. We know that people who have had really difficult situations and you are trying to survive and you are trying to eat, you are more likely to be in spaces where you're going to self-medicate, and that turns into a space of addiction, and that can turn into a space of a criminal history. And now you've found your way to not using and you are in recovery. I always say, the quickest way to get someone to relapse is force them on the street, right? Take away the skills and tools and things they need. So I would just point out that you create an individualized policy that says, I look at each person and I do not have blankets on their criminal history. We've talked about, there's a case years ago, the guy who was huffing paint. I always talk about this case. It's years old, but it's because this guy had this incredibly long criminal history. And if I just showed you that criminal history, you would tell me there is no reason that anyone would ever want this person to lease up in their unit. It's been arrested time after time after time after time. But if you look at the rest, if you look at the space in which he was able to get clean, where he was running a program for youth who were addicted to drugs so that they could find their way to recovery, He's an outstanding person and a great tenant. So I would just point to the idea of ensuring that you individualize your lease-up process and not have those policies.
I appreciate that. Luana, I'll turn it back over to you as we start to wrap up. What would be, and to Jay's point about the humanity of the people that we're talking about, we're not talking about statistics or numbers, we're talking about human beings, our neighbors and friends and family members. If there is one thing you want the audience to take away today about renting to people who have a criminal history, who are leaving incarceration, what would you want the audience to take away?
Not to look at their criminal history and look at the person, giving the person an opportunity to sit down with you and have a conversation. That can make a whole difference when you really listen to what the background of their lives is, because everybody didn't wake up wanting to do something to wind up in the criminal system. You know, some things have led them to do the things that they've done, and they are remorseful for it, and now they're being punished even after they've served their time. They're still being punished when they're trying to come out and make a difference. And some of them have families, and it causes a problem for them to even see their children or reunite with their children because they can't get housing. If they can't find housing, then they can't have a job because you have to have an address in order to get a job. So there's a lot of things that happens in their lives that keeps them into the situations that they're in and wind up back into the system again. So I would say to actually listen to them as a human and not look at their past and kind of see them in the present.
That's a phenomenal response, and I completely agree with you. I'll speak for Jay, and I'm sure he does as well. I know him well enough. Jay, I'll open it up to you. Do you have any last thoughts or any one thing that you want the audience to take away from this morning?
So, you know, I thought about that as you were asking that question. The question and the space that we're in talking about individuals who are ex-offenders, who are coming out into our society, right, who are dealing with the really difficult transitions sometimes. In 1988, I was at a friend's house, and we were hanging out having pizza and beer. You know this story. I heard dogs. Next thing you know, there are police officers coming into the house. I'm arrested for attempted murder and armed robbery. Now, as it turns out, I had nothing to do with it, by the way, just to be clear. But it doesn't matter, right? I'm there, I'm arrested, I am taken to jail, I am in the system. If we follow the logical pattern that we've been talking about today, and we allow for landlords and housing providers to say, that person has a criminal history, that person was arrested, we are not going to provide them housing. I am not sitting here today. It doesn't happen. I end up, like so many others, as you heard before, people passing away from drug addiction, right? Because I would be one more. So when we talk about individuals and we talk about this idea of people with criminal histories, they're not, you know, the terrible people of society that we need to cast away and turn our head away from. Right? They're our brothers and sisters, our mothers and fathers, our children. And we have to view them that way. If it is your child who makes the mistake, who does something terrible, and then goes to prison, does their time, comes out, do you not want them to have an opportunity back in society? So the thing that I would take away is, or give to you to take away, is when you look at criminal history policy, when you think about what we can do, start with, it's my kid, it's my mother, it's my brother, what would I want that policy to look like for them? And if you work from there, then I think we get an honest space for people.
Phenomenal from both of you. I really appreciate your time this morning. And what I would like to share with the audience and to make sure that we take away is that today is just the beginning. We're here because we care. Everyone in this room cares and wants the policies, wants the practices, wants housing access to be better. Almost a year ago, HUD published this press release that said in the coming weeks, there will be HUD rulemaking on criminal history and specific policy changes and technical assistance provided to what needs to change pragmatically, what we've been talking about today for federally funded housing providers. And the press release continued, and it gives us a series of bullet points that says the exact same things that Sarah's been talking about, that Jay and Luana have just talked about not considering arrests, about not having blanket bans, about looking at the individual. And today, we are still waiting for that proposed rule. But we are here today in Pittsburgh, representing Pittsburgh and Western Pennsylvania, because today and here, we are going to be ahead of it. We are taking the steps forward, and we will continue taking the steps forward in order to not simply comply with this rule when it comes out, but to be proactive in making these changes now, not for compliance, but because it matters to us and the communities that we live in. And what fair housing is about, the heart and soul of what I do, is about housing choice. That those of us with criminal histories who've been incarcerated, who have done what society has asked, that what fair housing is about is removing the fire that's in front of them in order to get home. They've done what's required, they've done what's necessary, and now they're trying to get back home. And fair housing is about that choice and that opportunity to come home and to have a successful, happy life because they had the opportunity to do so. So, I cannot again thank you all for coming out during this incredible rainstorm that we're having. Thank you so much. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you to Sarah Pratt for coming all the way to Pittsburgh. We're gonna have lunch right outside in the hall. You can feel free to bring it into the theater, talk, mingle, come and go. And please be back here at 1 o'clock, and we will do the same thing, but regarding language access for our immigrant and refugee communities. Thank you all so much.
I am the language access liaison for our department. I have learned a ton from our multicultural service providers and resettlement agencies, and we're lucky enough to have some of them here with us today. So our next speaker is Brenda Lee Green. She is the Refugee and Immigrant Services Program Manager at the Jewish Family and Community Services. She has 25 years as a grant administrator and trainer, and I fell in love with her when she gave us our cultural competency training early in 2023 at the city, because I thought that I knew a lot, and it turns out there were a lot of gaps in my knowledge, and she was able to fill those gaps for me. So hopefully she'll be able to do that for you today too. Everybody please welcome Brenda Green.
Thank you for the warm introduction and for being here at the Kelly Strayhorn. I'm so excited I'm on the stage. I feel an urge to take the A train, but it's great to be in a wonderful facility like this. I also want to point out that there's a lot of gaps in my knowledge as well. This is a continual process. We're lifelong learners when we undertake a lot of things, but especially when it comes to the area of cultural humility and cultural competency. It's an ongoing process. Okay, so do we, yeah, am I hitting it the wrong, sorry. Obviously, I have huge gaps in technology.
It's all right, we're a team here. They didn't get it. So I'm going to send it right now. Apologies.
Okay, I have the flash drive in my bag, if that'll help. The one I sent you.
Yeah. Why don't we try that? Sorry about that, folks. It's not Brenda, it is me, and we did not get the PowerPoint quite properly set up, but we're working on that right now.
staff here is great, so I'm sure they'll get it loaded very quickly. While we're waiting on the PowerPoint, let me just give you a little snapshot of what we're going to do. And don't panic, we're not going to run over, even though we're getting a late start. I'll adapt as we go. What we're going to do when we talk about language access, which we know is a protected class, what does that mean? Like, who are these people we're talking about where language is an issue? Because they're emergent English speakers. So that's what we're going to talk about in this presentation, is exactly who's here, or what I like to call sort of an immigrant overview of our community. Because Pittsburgh and Allegheny County have a long immigrant history. I mean, even when you look back, like during World War II, Albert Speer told Hitler, by the time the United States comes into the war, they came in late during the last war, by the time they come in, we'll be in London. Like, you don't have to worry, like, because it took Germany so long to go from a peacetime economy to a wartime economy, as it did the other allies, France and Germany, France and England and the Soviet Union. The US did it in a fraction of the time, and it was mainly because of the steel industry in Pittsburgh. That was back in the day when US Steel ruled the world, and its seat of power was the Hector Thompson Works in Homestead. And we went from very quickly from a peacetime economy to a wartime economy. And that work was done by immigrants, or what we refer to as the old immigrants, not old in age, but the more traditional immigrants to this area. So we're talking about people from Eastern Europe. We're talking about people from the Middle East. We're talking about people from Northern Europe. And they came here to give their families a better life. And so while their sons were fighting on beaches in Europe and the Pacific, they were working double shifts in coal mines and steel mills to turn a peacetime economy into a wartime economy. Now we talk about new immigrants to our region, which are coming from the Far East and South Asia and Latin America and the continent of Africa. And those were immigrants that came before too, but overwhelmingly we talk about sort of an old immigrant and a newer immigrant in our region. So this presentation is really going to talk about who are the immigrant communities and what languages they speak and where they live, and a little bit about their culture and about some of the barriers that they face, housing being one of the largest. Okay. Oh, all right, great. So thank you so much for your patience. Let's see. Okay. No matter what I talk about, because I train on a lot of different programs and topics, but I always start with definitions, because it's really important to know that we have a common language and that we're using the correct terminology. So for me, I use the term immigrants inclusively. Anyone who needs assistance from our department is an immigrant. These are people that have a barrier to accessing services in Allegheny County and in Pittsburgh because of a barrier of culture or language, like they're unfamiliar with U.S. systems and policies and laws, or they have a barrier of language. So I use that term inclusively. But these are actual legal immigration terms. So when we talk about things like the safety net and things around benefits that they might be eligible for or programs, it's important to understand clearly what their immigration status is. So that's why I always start with definitions. So an international is anyone who's not born here and is coming here for a temporary span. So if you want to see an international, go to Oakland, okay? We have a large number of really high quality, nationally recognized, internationally recognized universities in Pittsburgh. We draw a lot from abroad. A lot of the faculty are internationals. Physicians in both UPMC and Allegheny General, a lot of them came here to do postdoc work. and they ended up staying and being a vibrant part of the community. So we have a lot of internationals. Tourists are internationals. People here on temporary work visas. So these are people that are here temporarily and are not planning to stay long term. Now that may change, but that's the initial way they enter the country. So then an immigrant is anyone who is born abroad and is coming here to take up permanent residence. This could be people that have gotten a green card through the green card lottery. It could be people that are coming here under some temporary status and then change it. It could be, someone that's coming here on a fiancé visa. There's a lot of different visa standards under this. But these are people that are eventually going to take up permanent residency here and hopefully apply for naturalization and become U.S. citizens if they choose to. The next one is asylum seeker, and this is the term that's probably the most often misused. Okay, people frequently say to me, I'm an asylee, and what they really mean is I'm applying for asylum. The asylee process is a very long and laborious process, but these are people that are fleeing some type of oppression or well-founded threat of oppression, and it could be anything from not being able to work in your chosen field to things like torture, imprisonment, anything like that, death. So these are people that have a well-founded fear, and they come here and they have to provide documentation. Forget anything that you've ever seen in a Hollywood movie about asylum. Rudolf Nureyev running through the streets of Paris, followed by his KGB escorts, and he falls into the arms of a French citizen and says, I want to be free, and he's granted asylum. It doesn't work that way in any country in the world, including the U.S. It's a very long process. Parolees are people that are here for a temporary stay. So this could be because of something that's happening in their country. Most commonly, it's humanitarian disasters. Like, we have a large Haitian community in Pittsburgh. The people that have been here longer have come because of hurricanes and earthquakes in Haiti, and they got temporary parolee. It is not a criminal designation. When people hear the term parolee, they think like, oh my God, Castro emptied his jails and he sent all the criminals here. No, the people that came here from Cuba came under parolee status, but they were fleeing oppression under Castro. So sometimes it's environmental, sometimes it's a temporary political upheaval, or a situation like with the Ukrainians right now and the war that's going on there. So there are a variety of Haitian parolees here. There are Ukrainians, there are Cubans, there are a lot of different people that are coming. Venezuelans are coming right now under parolee status. The refugees are people that, like asylum seekers, have fled some type of oppression in their homeland. And it's based, the actual definition here from the UN High Commissioner on Refugees is listed. So it's based on ethnicity, religion, political opinion, or membership in a specific group. So membership in a particular group in some countries could be a labor union. Like, you could be jailed for being a labor union. You could be jailed for being a member of a student group on a campus that is advocating for free elections or a change in government. So these are people, because of threat, they have left their homeland and went to a second country. And there were certified through a very detailed process by the United Nations as refugees. And if they are one of the fortunate few, they will get third country resettlement in another country through IOM, the immigration organization, and PRM, that's the national, and so it comes through our State Department. Here, the U.S. refugee program is managed by our State Department, but because the Constitution states, like the military, the State Department can only work abroad, they can't manage domestic programs, the money is funneled through Health and Human Services, but it is a State Department program. They come here, they get assigned a resettlement agency, and then they receive everything from cultural orientation to employment assistance and case management, and housing is one of the biggest things that we help them find, housing. So you'll notice that there's one thing missing up there. You don't see sexual orientation. Actually, sexual orientation and gender orientation is a reason for refugee status, but this definition was written at the end of World War II, so no one was talking about that. Although, to show how far we've come, last week USCIS announced announced that the N600, the application for citizenship, effective in 2024, is going to have a gender, in addition to male or female, they will have another box for people that are trans. So that's a huge step forward. Okay, and then out of status and undocumented are probably the ones that are most confused, along with asylum. People think that anyone that's here that doesn't have a green card is undocumented or out of status. Actually, there's two separate things. Out of status means that you came here legally, that you came with a visa. It may have been a student visa or a tourist visa or a temporary work visa, but when the visa expired, you did not leave the country. So now you're here, you're undocumented, or I mean out of status, but you still have documentation. Undocumented people are people that have no, like they don't have a passport from home, they don't have a visa, they don't have any type of documentation. Those are the minority. There's this myth out there that everyone that does not have a green card is undocumented. Or the other myth is that everybody, swims the Rio Grande at midnight and comes into Texas illegally. That does happen. I'm not denying that. But the majority of people that come here and are now undocumented came here on a plane. So there's a lot of stereotypes out there. So this is just a quick synopsis of the different types of immigration statuses. And under each of these categories are many difference. So you're going to, in your packet, you received a handout that shows just an assortment of some of these visa statuses, and then in the next column will show what kind of benefits they're eligible for and any type of emergency assistance. The reason this is important and why I always stress this is because when you're a helping professional, we want to be really cautious not to recommend a benefit or a program to someone that they may not be eligible for. Like if I tell someone they're eligible for, financial assistance like SNAP benefits or something like that, and they're not, I made a mistake. I make mistakes a lot, but it could hurt them through an immigration process as a result, because technically if you're not eligible for a service and you accept it, you're committing fraud under the strict legal definition. So we want to be really cautious about that. So that's why that handout is in your thing. I also want to caution you that this is not an absolute document. You shouldn't make legal advice from it, but it's a good thumbnail sketch to let you know, and that's why these definitions are important. Outside of that, to me, like I said, I use the term immigrant inclusively, and when you look at our histories, we're all immigrants, or all the descendants of immigrants. Okay, so just a brief comment about global migration. Right now, we have a humanitarian crisis at our southern border, and actually it's growing at the northern border too, but that doesn't get as much attention. And the numbers aren't nearly as large. And there's no doubt there's a lot of problems that need to be addressed, and under our current immigration policy, they're probably not going to be addressed in a productive manner. But when you look at a lot of the op-ed pieces and media coverage, or just listen to what people are talking about on public transit, there's this impression that this is a new situation. It is not a new situation. And many people, myself included, think global migration is the norm, not the exception. Because really, since the beginning of time, people have migrated. It's only become an issue once there were more established borders. When you look at the history of mankind, for most of it, there were no borders, and the fact that there are armed borders at countries now is really something that showed up at the latter part of the 20th century, mid to late 20th century, after the World Wars. So migration is normal. And when you think about why people migrate, like if any of you out there grew up on the Little House on the Prairie books like I did, you know that when the game ran out in one area, then Pa gathered up the Ingalls family and they got on a wagon train and they moved west. like the search for new food when crops fail. The biggest internal migration in this country happened during the Dust Bowl, during the Great Depression, when you had huge, like more than half of the population of Oklahoma and many of the other states in the Midwest and the central part of the United States moving west toward California. If you've seen the movie Grapes of Wrath or read the great novel, where everybody ends up in these encampments because their land was not fit to grow food anymore. I mean, that's an example of internal global migration. Also, during the Great Migration north into the industrial Midwest and the industrial North by African Americans escaping Jim Crow and moving into places like Detroit and Chicago and Pittsburgh. So migration is quite normal. And even here in this country, for environmental reasons, flooding, natural disasters, hurricanes, people migrate all the time. The other thing, people migrate for adventure. Like we talk about Alaska being the last frontier in the U.S. People frequently have moved from country to country looking for adventure. Also for education, for economic means. One of the greatest influxes into our country is not what's happening now at the southern border. It was during the potato famine in Ireland, when the Irish population in this country increased tenfold. Likewise, during the early 20th century, when the pogroms were at their worst in Eastern Europe and in Russia and then in the new Soviet Union, the Russian population in the United States, particularly in New York City and other urban areas, increased dramatically. So migration is a normal thing. I mean, people move to escape shortages of food, war, economic, environmental disasters, but they also move for other reasons that are more positive. So it is the norm, not the exception, in my opinion. Okay, oops. Oh, shoot. Okay, we'll just skip that last slide. So this is looking at global migrations really through most of our history. And the reason I share this is because, again, it shows the difference between the old immigrant and the new immigrant. So when you look at that large green swath in the middle, that's Pittsburgh's immigration. Those are people coming from Europe, particularly Eastern European. We have a large Slavic population here in Pittsburgh and Allegheny County. So that's what that green is. Also, I want to point out that large red arrow that's coming from the continent of Africa. That's the North Atlantic slave trade. And I always like to mention this because I think it's important for us to remember we have this myth in America that, everybody comes to America for a better life and they come here willingly and they really want to be here. In reality, there are people in our lives, relatives, colleagues, neighbors, friends, when we start talking about family trees and tracing our origins, their origin in this country started in the hull of a slave ship. So it's really important to keep that in mind. And our economy is based on a slave economy going back to the Civil War. And even before, paying off our debts to the French for the Revolution was mainly paid back by the southern states because they were using slave labor. Okay. Okay. I'm having trouble with the slides. I apologize. Over here? Okay, there we go. I'm hitting it too straight on. Okay, so this is now the most congestion migration routes. So it's not good migration versus bad migration, which is often what's played in the media, but it's different migration. We're seeing immigrants from other parts of the world. Very few from Europe right now, except the former Soviet Union. When you look at the republics that were once part of the Russian satellites, so places like Belarus Belarus and Moldova and the Ukraine and Yugoslavia and the Czech Republic. So immigration is still high from those areas, but in general from Europe, they're less. Okay, this slide we're not going to spend any time on, but I can't help myself because I'm one of these people that get all warm and fuzzy when they see data. So if you're one of these people that just love statistics, you're my peeps, and this slide is for you. But it gives you a snapshot. These are from IOM. This is the most recent data, which was done a couple years ago. And there are a couple things that I want to point out with this slide. Is one, the number of people that are waiting in refugee camps. There are more refugees worldwide right now than there were at the end of World War II, back when we referred to them as displaced persons, okay? 8 out of every 10 refugees is a child under the age of 15. And less than 0.5% of refugees will ever get third country resettlement. So we have, both political and humanitarian crisis worldwide. A lot of these people are escaping genocide in their homelands. The other thing that I wanted to point out is that bottom statistic, the victims of modern slavery, that we have 40+ million people that are being trafficked. So the idea of enslaving people is something that we really haven't overcome. Now it's not so much based on race, it's based on poverty. And although most of this is happening abroad, the people that take advantage of this are often people in U.S. cities, especially when you look at forced labor and the sex trade. And then the last thing I'd like to point out is that one about the 6.7 trillion of US dollars that are being sent abroad. The amount of money that people that are immigrants in this country are earning, a lot of times at minimum wage, and are sending home to their families, are propping up entire communities. So that money is more than what any non-governmental organization is doing in aid or relief. So it's a really substantial thing, and it shows also what a vital force in the economy immigrants are to economic growth. Okay. All right, so we're just going to go right to this slide. I apologize for the technology issues. So these are some of the factors when you're working with people that are looking for housing, and they represent people that are limited English speakers, or what I call emergent English speakers, emergent English learners. These are some of the other things that they're dealing with, is just the idea of that whole acculturation, getting used to a new environment. And just think about if you were in a situation where you had to suddenly move to another country and walk away from your life, your career, your culture, the food that was easily available to you that was important to your culture, and now you're suddenly in a new environment where you have to learn new regulations, you have to learn new protocols for getting access through government programs, and you have to learn a new language. Like, I know that I would not be able to fare as well as the clients that I work with. I'm amazed at the resiliency of the people that I work with every day, because I know that I could not survive. But sometimes we're surprised at what we can do, and I certainly see that day in and day out. So aside from just that, there's a big issue with gender roles, because gender roles are very unique to families here in the US, but also in other cultures as well. So oftentimes people come here, like we have clients who in their country, children aren't forced to go to school. Like, if you can afford school, you send your children to school. And so the priority might be to send male children over female children, or maybe it's the law that female children can only go to a certain age. Maybe it's the cultural norm that women don't work outside the household, or women only work in certain professions. And then they get here, and oftentimes it's the women that are able to find work first. So that causes a lot of disruption in the family because it's a huge adjustment. But certainly the generational conflict is the one, in my opinion, is the most, can be the most damaging to the family and the most difficult to overcome. Because when you talk to people, immigrants, that are parents, one of the things that they say when you ask what you want for your children, first, like all parents anywhere, they want their children to be safe. Second, they want them to be free of hunger. And 3, they want them to be happy. And then they also want them to be successful and to be good Americans, whatever that means in their family. But then what happens is those small children eventually turn into American teenagers, and everybody freaks out because then they're pushing at boundaries around dress and language and music and, you know, the norms of what adolescence would be in the culture that they were born into. And often that causes a lot of conflict in the family, but it also can cause a lot of mental health problems for the children because, you know, we all code switch. Every one of us in this room code switch. Like, I may act one way at work, you know, more professional. I act and speak differently when I'm with friends at a club or out at a restaurant. Maybe I act differently in church, or, you know, if I'm going to lobby a legislator, I'm very proper and I, act differently. We all code switch. It's something that we do, but for children that are developing, it can be really dangerous to code switch. So they literally, there's a sociologist named Ruben Rumboldt, who himself was a Cuban American. His family fled after the Castro regime took over in Cuba. And so he grew up in a very traditional family, and his parents wanted him to stay within, the Cuban community in Miami, and stick very close to the culture, where he was a high school student and he wanted to be an American teenager. And he ended up doing his doctoral thesis on this because he remembered how difficult it was for him personally. He would go to school and change when he got to school, and then he would change before he got home. In some of his articles, he's talked about how he was embarrassed by his parents, but then he was overwhelmed with the guilt of that embarrassment. So, for children to have to code switch, he coined the phrase the 1.5 generation. They're not really Americans, but they're not really what they came as, because they sort of walk this road in between two cultures, which can be really tough. And certainly in our work, we've seen it literally escalate into more serious problems in the family. And then, of course, the employment is, they're learning new roles with employment. And one of the things we talk about with clients is that you have to make eye contact. When you go to meet a prospective employer, you shake their hand firmly and you sell yourself. You tell them why you're the best candidate for the job, when in reality, maybe in their culture, that immodesty is something that's really frowned on. Or maybe even making eye contact with someone who's in an authority position is considered rude or inappropriate. So it's learning a whole new system. And certainly interactions with landlords would definitely fall under that theory of somebody in power or authority, which is often when we have clients we feel that are being discriminated against, either in searching for an apartment or trying to navigate problems with their apartment. They're very much afraid to make waves or to file a complaint. And it's not because they actually fear the landlord, although sometimes they do worry about retaliation, and sometimes that's genuine, but it's more of a cultural thing. It's like, well, this is I'm fortunate to have this house and, or this apartment, and I shouldn't, this is somebody in power, this is someone in authority, and I need to be respectful of that. So all of this comes into play when we're working with this population. And then, of course, traumatic experience, particularly if we're working with people often who have undiagnosed PTSD because maybe they've been survivors of torture, or they fled because of persecution based on their faith or their ethnicity or their race. That's a huge issue, and so that comes into play. And so it again interacts with how they react with power figures, rather they be the police or landlords or physicians or their child's school teacher. And then, of course, the discrimination, like particularly in refugees, like they're taught when they're in cultural orientation, when they're in the refugee camps or they're going through the resettlement process, that you're going to America, where the land of the home and the free of the brave and everyone's equal, and then they get here and they face discrimination. So it's a huge adjustment. Okay, so in your packets, you have a handout that goes into this slide in more detail. So I really wanted to spend most of our time talking about how we can improve our work with people from the immigrant community. The first one, obviously, is language access, as we've been talking about at different times throughout the day today. Always, I recommend professional interpreters. I mean, that's the gold standard, because just because someone is bilingual does not mean they're an interpreter. Interpretation, like translation, is a skill, and it comes with a lot of experience and training. So just because someone speaks the language doesn't necessarily make them an interpreter. So my first choice is always professional interpreters. And certainly, if you're referring them to an organization for services that gets federal funding, under the Civil Rights Act, that organization is required to provide interpretation. So any federal program, state program, if they're going to UPMC or Allegheny General that receive a lot of money in medical research grants, they need to provide interpretation for a patient. And again, sometimes people are hesitant to ask for interpretation. Sometimes it's because they're learning English and they're proud of that process, and they should be. And so they think their English is a little better than it is, and they are speaking really well, but if you're talking about things really technical, like prep for a medical exam or understanding the regulations of a lease and how to pay, like who's responsible for what utility on that apartment unit, like it's really important to have that interpreter because important information can be missed. Generally, it's not considered best practice to use family members to interpret for other family members, but if interpretation is not available and it's urgent or it's a crisis situation, it's better than no interpretation. The one exception to that is children should never be used for interpretation. And I've heard of situations where literally 9-year-olds were asked to interpret for a parent in the emergency room of a hospital. That is never appropriate by any standard, any professional standard, and it can cause a lot of problems within the family. It's important to prep your interpreter if you're using an interpreter. Like sometimes I'll have to deliver bad news for a client, like, the referral that we thought we could get you to this program, it's not available, you're going to go on a waiting list or whatever, and they're going to be upset. Maybe they're going to cry. Our legal department does that all the time. A family's applied for family reunification, bring people here, and they find out that it's been denied, or a visa's been denied, or maybe they're looking at a 6-year wait. So it's not unusual for clients to get sad, to cry, to get angry. So you need to be prepared for that, and the interpreter needs to be prepared for that. Avoid jargon. It's, every field has its own language. Like, we have forms that have numbers, and we have, a million acronyms. Like, so they're not even unique to U.S. culture. They're unique to specific fields. I'll never forget when I first joined the staff of JFCS, we have a career services department, which at the time was called the Career Development Center. And my I raised some issue about a family that was struggling to find employment, and my supervisor said, you're going to have to raise that with the CDC. Well, I come from a public health background. I'm thinking, why would I be alerting the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention in Atlanta? Like, because, that was my idea of what CDC meant. So acronyms are really different, as are any type of jargon, because they are very unique to culture and to time and situation. Like, I lived in Philadelphia for 10 years, and I had no idea I was going to have to learn a new language when I moved to Philadelphia. So is it soda or pop? Is it rubber band or gum band? Is it gob or whoopie pie? I mean, those are fighting words. So, even within certain neighborhoods, there's different language, and a lot of it has to do with ethnicity and tradition. So we have to be really careful when we're working with community members from immigrant communities that we try to keep as much of that to a minimum as possible, or ask people, do you understand what I'm saying? And oftentimes, immigrants are overly polite, and they're so grateful for the assistance, so when you say, do you understand, they'll often nod, even though they don't. So I always ask people, tell it to me back, like, explain it to me. Like, I just want to make sure that you understand clearly what's in this lease, or you understand what the requirements are for this job, or whatever. So it's really important to keep language in mind all the time. Understanding that culture plays a big part in daily life. Every aspect of our lives is influenced by our culture, by ethnicity, religion, race, all of that comes into play. So it's really important. Also, the difference between concrete and abstract communication is really important, because people that are new to a language are thinking very concrete, okay? An example that I used in the handout in your packet, which was actually told to me by someone from Belarus, is that one time, she was very homesick when she first came here, and she had heard about the international rooms at the University of Pittsburgh, so she decided she'd make a trip one day. She got the information on the bus, and she went to Oakland because she wanted to see the Russian room. And as you know, the Cathedral of Learning it's one of the tallest buildings in the city, and certainly in Oakland. So the elevators go up huge number of flights at a time very quickly. So she got on the elevator, and there was a college student in there, and she smiled at him, and then he said, "What's up?" And she immediately panicked, thinking there was a problem with the with the elevator, because she had no idea what "what's up" meant, which could have just been a friendly conversation like, "What's happening?" So we want to be really careful about things like that. Is really important. And then some of the things that we don't want to do, because I want to be mindful of time, so we really want to focus on these. Never make assumptions. We don't live where the client lives, so we don't know, just like, if someone's experiencing a housing problem, we don't want to make assumptions about what the cause of that is, or if they can't pay their bills that month, what the cause of that is. We don't know, especially if we're working with people that have been victims of violence, or I mentioned earlier about domestic violence. It's easy to think, well, why did you stay in that situation for that long? I mean, we don't want to ever make assumptions. Jumping to conclusions, and also making conclusions or assumptions based on the ethnicity of the individual that you're working with. Because everyone is an individual. Like, that we know that there are certain cultural standards for people in certain cultures, but in general, everyone's an individual. So to say that, for instance, we in America, it's been my experience, have this impression that everyone that is Muslim is a very, very conservative or sometimes even radical version of that, when in reality, I have friends and colleagues that are female, and some of them wear a hijab and some of them don't. I have Muslim friends, some of them consume alcohol. Just like other people, that we have different degrees of religiosity in our households. So we never want to make assumptions about clients clients based on their backgrounds, their ethnicity. It's really important. The other thing is to ask questions. We want to ask questions. I'm a big proponent of asking questions. If you don't understand something, ask a question. But I'm also a big proponent of asking permission to ask questions. Like, there's something I was really wondering about your culture. Do you mind if I ask? And most people are really happy to share things about their culture and their experiences. Be very cautious of touch, because in different cultures, touch between genders, touch between people of a certain age or a certain social status is frowned upon. Also, we never know if someone has been a victim of violence. So even something as simple as touching someone's shoulder can sometimes provoke memories of violence. So be very cautious of touch. Okay, and then I'm gonna move to the handout. Oh, man. Okay, no. I'm really sorry about this. Everybody else moved the slides so well. I really apologize. I'm trying to get back to the last. No. Okay, sorry about that. So let's talk about the immigrants that are here. And I really want to center this around some of the stereotypes that we have. First of all, there's this idea that everybody that's an immigrant right now, if you listen to certain media outlets, is Latino, okay? That everyone that's coming to this country, which is ridiculous. First of all, Latinos have been here since before the Revolutionary War. So this is not a new thing, and the majority of people, even the majority of the people crossing the southern border right now, there's a large number of people from Turkey and Haiti. They're not all from Mexico or Central America or South America. Actually, reaching that southern border, when you look at migration routes from the African continent and from the Far East, a lot of them come through there. It's a very long trek. So that's the first stereotype or the first myth that we want to address is there. But who exactly is here then? Who's coming? So as I already mentioned while we were waiting for the PowerPoint to load, was that historically we are an immigrant city, and most of the early settlers to this region were primarily subjects of the British Empire. And then, of course, with Fort Duquesne and the French and Indian War, there were a large number of French settlers due to and the country itself was settled by, Spanish colonialism, British colonialism, and French colonialism. But then during the Industrial Revolution, we saw large numbers of people from Eastern Europe, which is what we primarily refer to as the old immigrants, as well as like Italians and the Irish. So the newer immigrants right now is what this chart shows here. So we have an increase in people from Africa and the Southeast Asia and from South America and Central America, with the exception, as I mentioned, from the former Soviet Union. So I'd like to call your attention to both the Latinos and the Africans, because I see a lot of similarities here in the misconceptions that I hear people talking about. Because overall, we think that these are monoliths, that everybody is the same coming from this. So for instance, for Africa, this is a continent, not a country. There are more than 60 individual countries in Africa. Each one of them has their own government. They have their own music, they have their own art, their own dance, their own food, their own religious observations, and their own language. And some of them have multiple official languages. So they're all unique. But Americans think anyone that comes from the continent comes from Africa, like it's a country. And everything that we know about Africa we learned in a Tarzan movie. And that everybody speaks Swahili. When in reality, this is a hugely diverse population. So people come here as asylees, asylum seekers, they come here as refugees, they come here as immigrants. A lot of them come here to do postdocs. I mean, there's a huge diversity within the African community here. So there's a lot of people from southern and central Africa, and some of them are immigrants and some of them are refugees. The large refugee communities are people from the Democratic Republic of the Congo, the Sudan, and Somalia. Most of the other African communities have come here through immigration. So extremely diverse communities. When it comes to Latin America, it's the same thing. Like, to say someone speaks Spanish is to say what language they speak. That's all it says. Because to be Latino is an ethnicity. It's not a religion. It's not a race. It's not a country affiliation. It is an ethnicity. So when you look at South America and then Central America and the Caribbean, these are extremely diverse countries. And like the continent of Africa, they all have very diverse cultures, music, food, language. The number one language spoken in South America is Brazilian Portuguese. And when you look at the size of Brazil and the number of people there, that's understandable. But we think everyone speaks Spanish. The other thing is there are a large number of people that speak indigenous languages, people that have a tradition going back thousands of years before the Spaniards arrived in North America and South America. So these are extremely rich cultures, but everyone has not everyone, but I see a tendency among the people that I speak to that think anyone who speaks Spanish is from Mexico, and they all cross the border illegally, which in fact is not true. So we're talking about very diverse and very rich communities in themselves. The Middle East, which is actually not a continent, but for the purpose of this slide, I broke it up because they're actually part of Asia. So we see a lot of Iraqis and Syrians, which are both refugee populations. And then, of course, then we have also the North African countries like Algeria and Libya and Egypt, which have different languages than some of the other countries in Central Africa. And of course, a lot of these countries have a mix of Christians, Muslims, and Jews. So very diverse populations. And then Southeast Asia and the Far East, we have the largest community from Southeast Asia in the region are the Bhutanese, which are predominantly refugees. They speak Nepali. Most of them have been here a lot longer than some of the other refugee communities, so they're a lot more assimilated to a certain level, because each community chooses their own level of assimilation. Just like most immigrants celebrate U.S. holidays in their own little way, but they still celebrate their own holidays and observances as well. And then we have people from India, Pakistan, a lot of people from Southeast Asia, large populations. These are predominantly immigrant populations. The Chinese are an outlier because we really don't know what the numbers of Chinese are. It's an extremely insular community, and they have lower census completion, or we suspect lower census completion than most other communities. We also suspect, and by we I mean the people that work with refugees and immigrants from a number of organizations, but also the FBI also shares this idea that this is a community that's heavily trafficked. So there are a lot of people here that are out of status or undocumented or have been victims of human trafficking. So we suspect the Chinese community is a lot larger than what it is, but it is a community, like I said, that is extremely insular. There's also a large Vietnamese community and a Korean community, a large Persian community in Pittsburgh. And so that's another thing, is we want to let people define themselves how they want to be defined. Like I mentioned the Bhutanese, just to give you a quick example, and then we're going to wrap up. We have a really large Bhutanese community. It's one of the largest communities in the area. And the adults tend to list themselves, like if you're taking demographic information, as Bhutanese, because these were people that were Nepali by ancestry, and they had made a life in Bhutan, and then all at once, the government changed, and all at once they weren't able to teach at universities anymore, and they weren't able to shop in certain stores. And then at one point the Army came and they took them in the back of trucks and they took them to the border and they walked to Nepal. So these are people that were Bhutanese even though they were Nepali by ancestry. And so if you ask them their country of origin, they're going to say Bhutan. But I've noticed with their children and grandchildren, they identify as Nepali because a lot of them were born in refugee camps or born in the U.S. And so Bhutan to them was the oppressor, and they have no association with that. So then they say that they're Nepali. Likewise, rather someone defines themselves as Persian or Iranian has a lot to do with their personal history. So we always ask people how they want to be defined, which I think is really important, whether we're talking about gender, professional status, any type of terminology we're using, but certainly with ethnicity. That's really, really important. Like there's a large Burmese community here, and as we know, the actual country is called Myanmar. But again, these were the persecutors. So none of these clients will ever say they're from Myanmar. They're Burmese. So out of respect for them, we use that term. Just like, some people say they're Israeli, some will say they're Palestinian. Whatever they tell us is what we enter into the database, and that's what I encourage people to do, is ask people how they want to be defined. So this is a really quick snapshot of who is here. One last thing that I want to mention, because we are talking about housing access, is that I used the analogy while we were waiting for the slide presentation to be loaded, the analogy of the immigrants during World War II. Back then, everybody lived in distinct neighborhoods. Like, the Irish lived on the north side, the Poles lived in Polish Hill. Everybody had a neighborhood. Like, the Croatians and the Slovaks lived in Lawrenceville. Like, everybody had a set neighborhood. And when you think about it, it makes sense. Because why wouldn't you want to live where people spoke your language, worshiped the way you did, dressed the way you did, and ate the same food that you did? Plus, there is security in that. And when I first came to JFCS, we could still divide where people lived based on their ethnicity. Like, for instance, we have a really large Uzbek community here, and most of them live in Greentree. But anymore, that's not the case, and the primary reason is because housing is so difficult to find, that people are looking for housing, and they would prefer to live in this neighborhood because there's a large number of people that they identify with, but housing may not be available to them because of that. So the housing shortage in itself for affordable, safe housing has really influenced the way immigrant communities live and reside. So I'm going to wrap up. We're almost out of time. I do apologize for the technology issues and your forgiveness on that.
Thank you so much, Brenda. I did want to give a quick opportunity for any questions if anyone does have any. Sorry, Brenda. But we do have the microphone down here on the front right of the space here, so if anyone's interested in asking Brenda anything. And if not, we are about to have a language access panel where some of your questions may be answered anyway. So if our panelists would like to come to the stage, then we'll get that started. All right, so this wonderful panel is full of expertise, and I will allow them to go individually to give you a brief introduction of themselves.
Hi.
I think you can.
Hello. Hi, my name is Cristina Vallarta Silva. I'm the Policy and Advocacy Manager from the Latino Community Center.
Hi, I'm Dejana Bates. I am a staff attorney at Community Justice Project. A lot of my work is in the language access space, and I'm happy to be here.
Hi, my name is Simone Vecchio, and I'm the Director of Family Services at Hello Neighbor. We are a refugee resettlement agency and also have a lot of programs for post-resettlement.
Thank you. So we'll get us started with just a quick overview of your experience serving the limited English proficient population in their search for housing?
At the Latino Community Center, we receive many families, newcomers that are in search for housing, and some of the difficulties that they face is regarding language access. From the beginning, when they want to search for houses, all the main pages online or those other sources, they are in English, so they always need assistance from us. Also, in figuring out the tenants' agreement and setting up their utility bills. At the center, we started Utility Providers Fair, where we bring in the families that newly just changed houses so they can set up their utilities with new providers, change their utilities, and fill in that gap. But we're also doing some advocating work to be able to not having to do that work eventually.
So for the last 5 years, I have worked with various paralegals in my organization with trying to help individuals find housing. Similar, we've had issues where organizations or facilities have said that they don't provide translation and interpretation services. They have asked for them, or they have been told to provide their own interpreter. Brenda's presentation was amazing, talking about how if these organizations are receiving government funding, they are supposed to be providing it for free for the individual. So a lot of my experience has been going into the community, going to other outreaches, working with local community organizations, and explaining what their rights are to the individuals so that they can try to advocate for themselves.
So for refugee resettlement agencies, the work in housing actually starts before a family even arrives. So as soon as we receive notification of travel, we're already looking to secure housing for that family. We're trying to negotiate leases. We're often looking at places, trying to find new landlords to work with. It's very difficult for us because, a lot of landlords don't want to rent that way. When somebody arrives as a refugee through the program, they do have 90 days of support from us. So we are actually helping the families to pay their rent for the first 90 days, their utilities, and we're vouching for them. So it's the resettlement agency that's signing the lease, it's the resettlement agency that's negotiating everything, it's the resettlement agency, most likely, that is going to be dealing with any kind of issues that arise. If the family has a problem with their apartment, they're coming to us. And so we have to continue that relationship with the landlords to make sure that we can resolve the issues. So for us, landlord relationships are really critical to the work that we do. But we do find it really difficult in the current housing market and situation here in Pittsburgh to find enough landlords that are comfortable working with an agency versus a person, because there may not be a social security number. You're not going to be able to meet that person ahead of time. But are you going to get your rent? Absolutely. Are you going to get your security deposit? Absolutely. So there's a lot of benefits also to working with resettlement agencies, but it's really difficult for us.
Thank you so much. To expand upon that, can you tell us about some best practices for engaging with service providers like yourselves, for the housing providers that would be working with you all?
Yeah, I guess for anyone that is open to renting to refugees and immigrants and working with the resettlement agencies, it's really important for us to have a good relationship and to have a point of contact, especially if there's a problem that happens in an apartment, or maybe there's some sort of issue with, maybe it's post the 90 days resettlement and the family is not quite understanding how to pay their rent. A lot of payments now are online. So being able to have that relationship and a point of contact is really important both ways. I would say also, there are very few landlords that will translate leases. It would be amazing if we could get them translated. Another issue that we run into is there are some landlords that we work with, and the lease is in some sort of software system, whatever you want to call it, and you can't actually print out a lease until you have a social security number. Well, unfortunately for a lot of these people, social security numbers are very delayed. It's not that they're not going to get it, but it's delayed with a lot of red tape and backlog. So if we have landlords who are willing to give us a lease that we can actually have somebody, write, hand sign, we can even sit down with an interpreter that we can have scheduled, have the lease read to them. That would be absolutely amazing, because the other thing that I think is really important to understand is that lease affects a lot of other things, such as school enrollment. Schools need proof of residency to enroll families, enroll students, and so without that lease, it makes our jobs even more difficult to get the kids enrolled in school.
Christina, did you have anything to add?
To that point, I think that also focusing on language access and, if possible, having bilingual staff and people that can engage with the community and can sit down and explain the lease. Like she was saying, having the lease is translated is very important, because I believe a lot in agency for the clients, and they need to have the tools to communicate with the landlord directly, and so have that open channel of communication and build that trust, and that report is really important.
And I'll just add, translated leases, absolutely. Or even having bilingual staff or an interpreter willing to sit down and go through the lease with the individual. I know as an English speaker, reading a lease in English is hard. As an English speaker. Now, trying to have to go through that hurdle and understanding all the requirements or the other things that are expected of someone in a lease that they can't read is very difficult. I'll also add, I believe HUD has posters that you can put in the lobby or in your front office, basically saying, if you need an interpreter, it comes in various languages, but if you need an interpreter, let us know. And that way individuals can point to the sign so that you're able to know that they need an interpreter. There's something also called I Speak cards that I believe HUD has as well, or you can look into them. It's a little piece of paper that someone's able to rip off. Again, it's in various languages. My name is blank, and I speak this language, so that they can tell you what language that they need assistance in. I will say that as housing providers, legally it is your responsibility to identify if someone is limited English proficient. And so having those signs, having those cards available for those who come in, whether they're tenants or interested applicants, is a great way for you to put forth that effort so that you can identify them. Brenda also mentioned that some individuals who may be considered LEP may be able to converse, maybe able to have a casual conversation in English, but that doesn't mean that they're able to conduct business in that language. So offering the interpreter regardless, I think, was a great best practice.
Thank you. Yeah, you've already spoken to this a little bit, Dejana, but if you had advice for housing providers who are engaging directly with the limited English proficient persons, what would that be?
See, I think I covered my advice. Just to quickly reiterate, allowing the individual to tell you that they need an interpreter, not being a judge of what you perceive their language skills to be, I think is really important. I can do small talk in Spanish. I wouldn't be able to handle a conversation, especially for something as important as a lease or receiving services through other organizations. The I Speak cards, the posters, I think those are my biggest pieces of advice.
I wanted to add one last thing that I have suggested to some housing providers is that in the schools they use a tool for translating between the teachers and the family members. So I have suggested to adopt that same tool with the housing provider. They have to invest, obviously, in getting that software, but with that they can provide that application, that app to the people that rent right away when they start the lease. So any communication that they need, my toilet broke, my shower's broken, they can just text directly to the housing provider and then they can come to them.
Also, I just wanted to add too, and this, not just in, housing, but across the board. I mean, we see all the time people who work with refugees and immigrants, I'm sure, can attest that children, other family members are used to interpret, and that is just never appropriate, especially for children. I mean, I've even seen situations where the police have showed up and instead of calling an interpreter, they've relied on a child who is there and has a little bit of English. Children especially should never be put in those circumstances, and often too, the conversations are high level, they could be very serious, and there could be a lot of technical terms, and a child is not going to be able to interpret those things. Likewise, even if you're using an adult who has a little bit of English, you really have no judgment of whether or not it's being interpreted accurately, so you can't just rely on that.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, the reliance on a child to be able to interpret terms of a lease just seems a little baffling to me, but I imagine that it happens all too frequently. I know Brenda had already spoken to some of the different cultural norms to be mindful of when working with these immigrant populations. Is there anything that you would add to that to be mindful of, just from your experience in working with that population?
I would say specific to the Latino population, when we talk about being mindful of different cultural norms or also different family structures and how they work. For example, in the Latino community, there is a very strong family unit, and decisions, if there is a family live together, they are going to be taken as a family. So the landlord should be aware of these differences. Maybe it takes a little time to make the decisions because they need to be consulted and taken as a unit.
I think too, one thing I just want to add is, refugees and immigrants, they're in a new home, but they still take pride in their home. And they value their home. I've been into so many families' homes that, they just always make you feel really warm and welcome, and they really take pride where they live. And they want to be involved in the community if given the chance. So I think just really being open to housing immigrants and refugees is really important. And, and a lot of immigrants don't have a resettlement agency behind them, but maybe just exercising a little bit of understanding or seeking out some organizations that you can contact for help, for their expertise. Brenda from JFCS, the Isaac program, Immigrant Services and Connections, or any of the resettlement agencies, Latino Community Center. There are so many of them that you can just reach out to for advice and just guidance, and working with that population just would really go a long way.
And I'll just briefly add, I don't know if this is necessarily a cultural norm, but I will acknowledge that we're talking about individuals with a different governmental structure, different things that are maybe not seen as acceptable, but as commonplace. And so I think a couple people mentioned it today about a fear of retaliation. We all know and acknowledge that it is illegal to retaliate. However, there are certain things that are hard to legally prove are retaliation, even if you know in your gut is retaliation. Or I've heard of individuals speak about, they were talking to me in English. I really don't understand English, but they were looking at me mean. They were looking at me as though I was less than, and that can feel like retaliation. There's a lot of concern, even if they have status, that any complaints could affect their status, affect their safety, and that's not even to get into the fact of whether they have children or not.
Yeah, I mean, just to add to that a bit, we at the Commission, we receive discrimination complaints. We have protections in place for people of limited English proficiency, but we do encounter that as well for even people who have status. They are unwilling to come forward to make complaints because they're just nervous about working with a government entity. They don't know how the information is going to be collected. But I just want to make it clear that the Commission does not collect that information. We don't ask for citizenship or immigration status information unless it's directly relevant to the complaint. And we don't report the information to anyone. We're not keeping a a database of this information or sharing it with any other government entity. So just to clear that up a little bit.
I'm sorry, can I add one more thing?
Please.
So I do also want to acknowledge, not just for those in the housing spaces, but really I would say any of us in this room, we are in the position of power in that dynamic, and keeping in mind as we're communicating, as we're having these conversations, as Brenda mentioned, being clear, being, not making promises that we can't follow through with, and keeping in mind that in this conversation there is a power dynamic, and us as advocates, as housing providers, are the ones in the position of power, and keeping that in mind as we're communicating.
Thank you. So in your experience, how can we make public housing more accessible for both documented and undocumented immigrants, particularly as it relates to mixed status families?
So I will say that undocumented individuals, first and foremost, are allowed to be in public housing. They're allowed the same access. The question goes to whether there is subsidy in a mixed family and how that subsidy should be applied across the family. However, just because they are undocumented, they still are allowed to apply. They still have the right to be there. And I think that's something very important to remember. I was talking to a housing provider at one point, and they were arguing not the point, but why does she want to be there? Because she's undocumented. One, it's respectfully not your place to ask that question. This is where she decided she wanted to be. But in addition, she had a mixed family. She had a mixed status family, meaning her children had status while she didn't. So there's still a certain amount of subsidy that is able to be applied to the apartment that still made it fiscally a good choice for her family and for her situation. But respectfully, she doesn't have to explain that to a provider. And so I think keeping in mind that specifically undocumented individuals and mixed status families have the same access as those who are documented. I will also just briefly say that Brenda talked about there's a lot of different statuses that are not just a green card. And I will say the immigration process is very confusing, but try to brush up on what those different statuses are that are still eligible for the subsidy. Because I've had to go to bat for clients who didn't specifically have a green card or there were issues within the system, but she was still eligible. But they were willing to deny her even though she was eligible.
I would say to make the public housing more accessible to mixed status families specifically, and for the undocumented community, I always think, and with the center, is making our community more visible. It's always talked about the refugees and immigrants, but immigrants, we have to divide it also with the undocumented immigrants that are very marginalized and unprotected category. So I think advocating for a more inclusive policies and ensuring that the housing agencies aren't denying someone access to these housings just because of their status, and also putting in protection some plan to be able to ensure that their housing rights are being safe regarding of their immigration status. So I think at the end is advocating for housing equity for everyone, and also for the human rights of the immigrant tenants too.
Thank you. So we want to take the opportunity while we have you all here. You are intimately familiar with working with the immigrant population. You know what the stories are. Can you tell me about a time where you engaged with a housing provider, public or private, where it was a good experience and what that looked like for you?
I don't know that I can say like a very specific experience that comes to mind right now, but as I mentioned earlier, the relationships that we establish with landlords are so valuable to us, they're priceless, and we want to make sure that we protect those relationships. We have some landlords who are absolutely amazing. Anytime there's a problem, they're more than willing to work with the family, they're more than willing to work with us. They're very receptive, they're immigrant friendly, they're happy that our families are there, they want to see them thrive. Sometimes families will out-migrate, and so then there's an empty apartment. Well, the advantage of working with a resettlement agency is we've got another family we can put right in there for you. You don't even need to look. So some landlords will even leave, any furniture that's left there, that might be left, they might save it for us. They might, let us go and pick up the keys somewhere and just go to look at the apartment. Maybe a new one has been vacated that we've never used before, and they trust us to be able to just go check it out. Because, we look at every apartment. We don't just rent blindly. We want to make sure that the apartment is fairly decent quality, that it's accessible. We try to get things that are close to transportation. We want to make sure it's safe. So, we have a lot of vetting too, just as much as landlords are vetting us. But we work with some really amazing landlords, and as soon as they have an apartment that's empty, even if it wasn't one of our families, they will call us right away and say, hey, I've got an apartment, because they know how difficult it is, but they also know that they know our reputation. They know that there's a resettlement agency that's really helping this family to get up on their feet. So there's a lot of great examples. I'm sorry, I just can't think of anything specifically right now.
No worries.
If I would have to think about an example, I remember a while ago we set up a family after some emergency that they had. It was only a single mom with children. We got them in the new housing. We were able to work with off the floor to get them the basic furniture they needed. And the landlord wanted to meet them. After they met them, and it was the landlord, it was she, heard the story of the family. She felt very moved, and she brought toys for the children. She wanted to fix some parts of the apartment so that everything was better for them.
That's great. So I'm at the end of my questions, and I want to be able to open it up to the audience for any questions that they may have. But if we were to just go around quickly and say, if the folks that are housing providers in this room today, if they could make one simple move today to be more welcoming to people of limited English proficiency, what would you advise them to do?
I would say research language access services. There's a bunch of different interpretation agencies out there in Pittsburgh who are absolutely amazing, and I would really encourage, and you can even talk to some of us in this room, we can give you names right off the bat, but I would encourage you to explore those services so that you know when you need them, you know where to go, you know what the expense, the cost is going to be, and you can see how easy the process is because it's not difficult.
I would say have a conversation with any of your front-facing staff. I've seen in my experience there are times where there are policies, however, they haven't been trained, they haven't been enforced, so making sure that your staff know what is expected or required of them, I think is a fairly simple way to make a big difference.
And speaking about the staff, I would think encouraging them to hire more bilingual and culturally diverse staff, it's very important too.
Thank you all so much for being here and for sharing with us today. I want to expand upon what Simone had mentioned with, looking into language access options. So we at the Commission are working with the Office of Immigrant and Refugee Affairs to provide a renting to newcomers program. So that will provide more information specifically for the private landlords on how to get involved if they would like to be, the resources that they could use to better understand what they're getting into and how to properly engage with these families. And there is a model lease that is translated into several different languages that we are offering to private landlords. in addition to a whole list of resources for language access. So if you are interested in that, please see me. Also, I work with Holly Hickling of the Global Switchboard. They have a language access training that they provide. So if anyone is interested in going through something like that and getting more experience in how to actually provide the language access, whether that's interpretation, translation, et cetera, please also reach out to me. The information is in your packet. But I'm going to open it up to any questions.
Good afternoon, everyone. You know, what we see at FHP a lot is we have an ongoing concern with how the social service agencies are expected to take on the translation and interpretation in order to get people with limited English proficiency, particularly access through the application process into federally funded housing. And so particularly to Jana and open to all the panelists as well is, what have you seen in your experience with what the required language access plans that should exist, that we have difficulty getting implemented locally due to the diversity of languages represented in our immigrant and refugee community? What do you think is the #1 aspect towards moving towards the recognition that immigrant and refugees are adult households who should have and do have the capacity to engage in an application process independently, to be empowered to do so themselves, and then to use the social service agencies for support, for assistance, but that they're able to interact with the federally funded housing provider directly as adults in order to engage in the application process, the follow-up, or even recertification after lease-up?
So there's a lot of different ways this answer could go. I think the most cost-effective answer, which I know is everyone's concern, is implementing some form of telephonic interpretation system. Therefore, an individual would be able to call into the number and complete the application over the phone. I think that is, one, how you access a lot of different languages, because whoever you're calling to interpret doesn't have to be in your area. Hiring bilingual individuals is amazing, and I think that is the gold standard. I think that's what we should all aim to. However, as we're in a city like Pittsburgh that has a lot of different small pockets of a lot of languages, and telephonic interpretation system, I think, is a great way to go about I think it's a great way to hit the most languages. I think that's the best way.
I would also say that you know, when you provide language access services, you're giving people their voice back, right? You're giving them an opportunity to take part in making decisions for themselves and for their own family. And so it's so critical. I think it's really important to keep in mind, too, that, you know, even though something might be translated, there are still people who may not be literate in their own language, so they may not be able to read an application. So having somebody on the phone can be really important as well and beneficial. We have a relatively newer population here in Pittsburgh. It's very small, but the Rohingya population is here, and they don't actually have a written language. And right now, it is virtually impossible to get an in-person Rohingya interpreter in Pittsburgh. So we have to rely on OPI, over-the-phone interpretation. I think, you know, responsibility is really important to understand because, I mean, the law says that anybody that does receive Title VI funding does have to provide language access services. They're required to do it, plain and simple. You know, often places will rely on the social service provider agencies to provide that service. And even when we take a client somewhere and we know that that entity has access to interpretation, we tell them we're coming for this appointment, we've made the appointment, we tell them what language, we need an interpreter, we show up and there's still no interpreter. And sometimes what ends up happening is they cancel the appointment because there's no interpreter. And then clients have to wait even longer for services, for their benefits, for their medical appointments. So I think just really understanding responsibility is key. And, you know, provider agencies will we will try as hard as we can to provide those services, but, often we're at capacity too. And so it's also not always our responsibility to provide it, especially if we're taking a client somewhere. So I think that's a really important piece of it, is the responsibility.
And I'd like what you say in the question, because that is part of our mission, is to empower the people for them so they can do it on their own. They are not children, they are adults who they can do all of these things by themselves. And sometimes, yes, we have the people that are illiterate, that they can't read, but then you have people that, okay, they can read, they can access the app on the website, but you go through the steps or you click on the things and not everything is translated. So making sure that every part in every language that you have it translated in your page, every link that you're linking, it goes to somewhere in Spanish that it's saying the right information. Because sometimes you're looking at the page in Spanish, it says click for more information here. You click it, it goes to all in English of something else that you don't know what is going on. So making sure that everything is troubleshooted on the websites on every language. It's also important to also give some agency to the clients, and the interpreters are very important too. And with that, there has to be quality interpretation. That is very important, because we have sometimes clients that, and in the Latino community, we have a lot of respect for authority. So when things are happening in a setting, we are not going to challenge the person, say, I don't understand what you're saying. People just agree, they say yes, yes, yes. And when they come to us at the center, they say, hey, what happened in this appointment, you understood? They said, oh no, I didn't understand nothing that happened. But didn't they put an interpreter? Yes, I had an interpreter, but I didn't understand what was happening, and the interpreter got mad, and those things happen in a call. And so also, I think the role of an advocate is very important too.
And so I'll just add on to that. You mentioned making sure that translation is accurate, making sure websites are fully translated. And I'm gonna touch on the thing that makes me very nervous, Google Translate. Google Translate makes me very nervous. I will give it the credit that in recent years, I've heard it's gotten a lot better. However, I will say that if you are using Google Translate, you should still obtain the services of a certified translator to proofread it. I would say that's also, again, I understand cost is something that a lot of us are concerned about. And so instead of paying a translator to go through and interpret a 30-page document, having them pay, that's a different cost than paying someone to run the same 30-page document through an automatic translator and then going through and proofreading it. Because even if it is translated, even if it's translated, there are expressions that don't make sense. It's missing context. I've heard of instances within my own organization where there was a letter and it was referring to the city of Reading. It translated it to leyendo, which is reading, like to read a book. So having a human go through that understands the context, that understands what's going on, technology is not to the point where we can ignore that. But I will say, Google Translate, I think, is a tool that can help someone who is certified. The other thing I will say is, I think it was in, either someone presented it or it was in the slides, that talked about getting into these community organizations that have these relationships and encouraging them to be certified translators. I know there is a little bit of concern in that we could be talking about some very personal business. However, when they're certified, when they're trained, you're gonna get into the confidentiality, you're gonna get into other things like that, and that also helps address the dialect issue. Because, I was just gonna say, just because even within one language, even as English speakers, Brenda mentioned soda versus pop versus Coke, that just because we speak the same language doesn't mean we have the same dialect.
Yeah, and there's a whole culture to interpretation and translation. So translation is not word for word for word for word. Also, a professionally trained interpreter adheres to the interpreter code of ethics and standards that are in the field. So I do language access training at Hello Neighbor, and I developed a training workshop for our community interpreters, and I give them that same set of code of ethics and standards, so I have them adhere to it as well.
I apologize, I'll simply follow up with a statement of, as someone who has done a tremendous amount of research into federally funded housing and their language access plans in Pennsylvania, Dejana's work and the Community Justice Project's work in having Northwestern Pennsylvania housing authorities now have public-facing statements on their websites with Spanish language applications, Spanish language statements, that there is translation and interpretation available. It's not only phenomenal, but it shows that it's possible and that it's not a ridiculous ask that we're making. And to bring that both to Western Pennsylvania and to address the languages represented in our refugee community. One more question to follow up, if anyone can speak to, or have you seen the sort of flip side when we talk about immigrants and refugees, where there's a differentiation between low-income immigrant and refugees and immigrant and refugees that have higher amounts of income. People who come through perhaps the university pipelines or the tech industry or healthcare. And what has happened in some of those instances is that people become real estate purchasers, they become home buyers, they become landlords, and because of barriers or limitations with the Fair Housing Act and other civil rights protections, no landlord in Pennsylvania has to proactively learn the Fair Housing Act and the fair housing laws prior to being a landlord. And so we can see instances where immigrants or refugees who become landlords in and of themselves, they then absorb America's racism or xenophobia, they bring their country of origin's own xenophobia, or whether it's a caste system or whether it's discrimination within their country of origin, and then apply that as a landlord into the rental market as well. Do you have any thoughts or ideas on how to engage with the population of immigrants and refugees who become landlords, who then start to or could have the discriminatory actions because they're seeing it perpetrated by the American landlords around them?
I don't know that I've actually seen anything. That's a really good question.
I have definitely seen landlords, like you're saying, that immigrants, they become landlords. And from the experience that I have had in the center with the families, they have told us that they're worse than the American landlords sometimes, because they just don't respect, because you're saying they don't practically have to learn the law. They just think that they can do whatever they want. So they can just kick them out the next day. They don't have to give them a notice for them to leave. That is a very big problem. I have seen it.
So I'll say I haven't seen it. And unfortunately, in those positions, a lot of what can be done is retroactive instead of proactive. That would take advocacy to require, a required landlord training to kind of get that kind of proactive help. Otherwise, everything would have to be retroactive after the harm is done. Then it would take, a lawyer or someone, a strong advocacy organization to come through and say, actually, what you did is illegal. And depending on how far it is down the line, again, we're getting back to the fear of retaliation. We're getting back to just concerns. And also, I will say one cultural norm, and I won't even acknowledge a specific country, but there are some countries that move slower. There's a wide spectrum about how fast cultures and individuals and people of different ethnicities and cultures move. We've heard, America, so even within America, New York City is a very fast city. These are things we hear, these are things we know, versus if we go to California or a more beach or coastal city, things are moving slower. And so what I've noticed in my work is that because in America we have these statute of limitations, a lot of times it was like, oh, I was getting to it, I had another urgent legal issue or another urgent issue that I had to figure out that wasn't much of a priority, but now that I can focus on it, it's too late, and unfortunately that happens a lot. That's not really an answer, but that I would say is my experience.
And I think it's about education and engaging them. It's going to have to be, unfortunately, most of the times after the fact, and when they see that, okay, this is serious, I can't just do whatever I want here. There are laws I have to follow, I have to respect. And sometimes, unfortunately, after they get a punishment is when they want to learn and they don't want to do it again. But it also entails sometimes that they don't want to rent again to immigrants. So that has a double-edged sword sometimes.
Well, I mean, we haven't really had much experience with having immigrant landlords, but, you know, an American landlord even, if we have a family that, you know, the landlord wants to evict them and we know that it's discrimination, we've already entered into mediation for things like that. So, you know, if the family is working with a social service agency, you know, fortunately they have someone who can help guide them. But, you know, families and individuals who aren't working with anyone, I mean, they probably don't even know what their rights are. They don't know who they can turn to. So it's really tough. I don't have any answer for that either.
And then last two follow-up points, I apologize. If anyone can speak to one of the big misperceptions about immigrants in the U.S. is that immigrants don't pay taxes. And so to clarify the concept that a social security number in ITIN is comparable and should be accepted in lieu of a social security number. And additionally, the concept that refugees are vetted by the U.S. government at a level of scrutiny for criminal activity, more than any of us in the room will ever be vetted by the U.S. government. And so a concept that a refugee should have a criminal history background that a landlord may be used to, or a credit history that is typical for their lease, is simply not applicable to the refugee community, and they are probably, as a group, a safer group of people regarding potential criminal activity than any single one of us in this room. Thank you.
Thanks, Megan. Really quick and shameless plug for FHP and the Commission. So we are in the process of continuing to offer landlord trainings for fair housing rights and responsibilities, essentially, for any kind of housing provider. They are free. We don't have our next date set yet, but if that's something that you're interested in or that you know someone who may be interested in, please send them our way. We're willing to go through it with anyone so that they can better understand what their obligations are as housing providers and how to avoid getting themselves into a situation which would then bring them before the Commission with a complaint. Unless our panelists have anything further to add to the conversation, I think that we can wrap up for today. Thank you all so much for being here. To everybody in the audience for taking the time out of your week to be here, to braving the rain, and it just means so much to us. Thank you to the Kelly Strayhorn Theater for this amazing space. For our interpreters who have worked very tirelessly today, and we are so thankful. FHP and Commission staff, thank you so much. And please, if you need anything further regarding the criminal history or the language access information we've talked about today, please reach out. We're happy to have more of a conversation. Thanks so much.